Hey family, welcome back to my video. Today we will see, what if Harry Potter had an omnipotent twin with supreme dark magic, part 2. Before we start, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the original author of this story for granting us permission to use it in our YouTube video. Your generosity is greatly appreciated. The author's creation and the original story's link in the descriptions, please do check that first. Now enjoy the video. Caden and Harry are sleeping in their respective beds, dreaming about the same thing at the same time. They slowly move down a dark hallway. The hallway has many bolted doors down its long sides. Soon they are running. Then, suddenly, they are being pulled along, the doors rushing past faster and faster. They can see the end of the hallway. It is a blinding light, still only a speck. It grows larger as they rocket towards it, then they fly right into it, and the light explodes all around them, engulfing them. Caden and Harry wake up with a cry, sitting straight up in bed. They're covered in sweat, looking disturbed. Caden and Harry look at each other, the former dropping his body back onto the bed, sighing deeply. Ginny, Caden, Ron, Hermione, Remus, Mr. Weasley, and Mrs. Weasley is standing in the hall, waiting, as Harry and Sirius descend the stairs. Well, Caden is leaning against the wall and checking his nails, trying to pass the time. "Morning, dear. Did you have a good sleep?" Mrs. Weasley said, looking up at Harry. "No, my scar kept hurting," Harry said, looking at Caden, who nodded at him in greeting. Remus and Mr. Weasley exchanged nervous glance. "Not secretive at all. Probably just nerves," Mr. Weasley said, ignoring Caden's snorts. "Yeah, nerves," Harry said, not believing that man at all. "Good luck, Harry," Mrs. Weasley said, bringing Harry into a hug. After the hug, Harry stands back, but is suddenly hugged by both Caden and Hermione. "They'll have to let you off, Harry. You were defending yourself." "I checked the laws," Hermione said, feeling Caden's arms disappear around her and Harry. "Thanks, Hermione," Harry said, sending Hermione a small smile for helping, and Caden for the hug. "What does he get a hug for?" Ron questioned, crossing his arms. Hermione responded to him without hesitation. "When you have to go to a disciplinary hearing at the Ministry of Magic, I'll hug you too." "Oh, sure, that's why," Ron said, huffing out a breath. Hermione laughs. "Ronald Weasley, are you jealous?" Ron glanced at the smirking Ginny and Mrs. Weasley, looking away. "Me? Jealous? Of course not. It just doesn't seem fair that you hug one friend more than the other, is all. Would you like a hug?" Hermione asked, raising an eyebrow. "No, I'd hate to force you." Ron miffed. Harry grins and shakes his head, sharing a smile with Caden. "Well, come on, Harry. Time to go," Mr. Weasley said. "Bye," Harry said, waving to the others, who return the gesture and leave with Mr. Weasley. "Is there something I can help you with, Mrs. Weasley?" Caden asked after the door was closed, looking at Mrs. Weasley. "You can help me with dinner," Mrs. Weasley said, walking towards the kitchen, expecting the Hufflepuff to follow her, and she was right. "Of course," Caden said, following Mrs. Weasley into the kitchen. Harry stands in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place, surrounded by Caden, Ron, Ginny, Fred, George, Hermione, Sirius, Remus, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, and Tonks. Delphine had left to go do something somewhere. "I knew it," Ron shouts. In the background, Ginny, Fred, and George are dancing a strange jig. "He got off, he got off, he got off," Fred, George, and Ginny said. Hermione hugs Harry again, not noticing Ron glowering at her. "Settle down, you three," Mr. Weasley exclaimed as the chanting and dancing died away. Caden and Mrs. Weasley comes out of the kitchen. "Sirius, we saw Fudge talking with Lucius Malfoy on level 9 again. Tell Dumbledore, next time he comes in, would you?" Mr. Weasley said. "Yeah, absolutely," Sirius said, nodding. "Well, I'd better be off. I've got a bewitched vomiting toilet to deal with," Mr. Weasley said, gaining the attention of Caden, who looked up and furrowed his eyebrows at that. "How does a toilet vomit?" "George, remember that concept? Vomiting toilet," Fred said. "Right you are, Fred," George said. "Also, I'm covering for Tonks on guard duty later tonight, so I won't be back until late," Mr. Weasley said. Harry's scar suddenly explodes in pain. He yelps and claps his hand to his forehead. "Harry!" Caden and Sirius exclaimed, both moving forward to catch him. Harry gasps with pain and falls into Caden's arms. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the pain vanishes. Shaken, Harry gasps as Caden and Sirius help him over to a chair. "You all right, Harry?" Sirius asked, looking at Harry with concerns. "Yeah, just my scar. The pain is getting stronger," Harry said. Caden notices Sirius giving a worried glance to Remus, who looks grim. Harry sits on his bunk, thinking. Caden is sitting on his bed, writing a diary that he had gotten a while ago. He didn't know when. Don't ask him. Sirius enters the room, but Caden and Harry barely react, still writing and gazing into space. "Caden, Harry, I've got something that might interest you both," Sirius said, gaining the attention of both Potters. Harry sits up while Caden walks towards them, sitting down on the other side of Sirius, who brandishes an old, tattered photo. "This was the original Order of the Phoenix. Found it while we were cleaning," Sirius said, watching in fondness as both Caden and Harry tilted their head to look at the photo. "That's Mad Eye and Dumbledore, right next to Daedalus Diggle, Marlene McKinnon. She was killed 2 weeks after this was taken," Sirius said. "Then there's Frank and Alice Longbottom, tortured into insanity by Death Eaters. Lupin, of course." He pauses. "Ah, Edgar Bones, they only ever found bits of him. Caradoc Dearborn, he vanished 6 months later. Hagrid, of course, Gideon and Fabian Pruitt. It took 5 Death Eaters to finish those 2 off. Me, of course. And there they are." Caden and Harry watched their parents beam up at them. "Our parents," Harry said, watching the picture for a long second. "I miss them, Sirius," he said, looking at Caden, who is still looking at the photo. "I know, Harry, I know. I miss them too," Sirius said, giving the photo to Caden, who took it and kept looking at it. Caden has never seen what his parents look like before. This is his first time looking at their faces. His godfather never has a picture of his parents, only his mother's pictures when she was young and was still friends with his godfather. "It's not fair that I got to spend so much time with them and you both didn't," Sirius said. Harry closes his eyes. "Why'd they have to die, Sirius, why?" "I don't know. I wish I did, but I don't," Sirius said, looking at Caden, who is still staring at the photo, making him smile sadly at the Hufflepuff. "I know I'm not your father, Harry, Caden, but I'll always be there for you, if I can help it." Caden finally looks up from the photo, giving Sirius a small, grateful smile, who returns it. "Thanks," Harry said. The door suddenly cracks open, and an ugly, menacing house elf enters, looking around suspiciously, muttering. "That mudblood with the scar." He cries. Why does he cry so? "Creature, get out of here. Now," Sirius exclaimed. "Oh, how the old mistress would weep to see the traitor in her house," Creature said, exiting the room. Who was that?" Harry asked. "Creature. He's been alone with the house for years. He's gone a bit funny," Sirius said, pausing. "You both better get some rest." He gets up and leaves the bedroom. Caden walks back towards the bed, placing the photo in his diary using a paper clip, going back to his writing. He looks back at the photo every once in a while, when suddenly Ron and Hermione burst into the room. "Harry, Ron and I, we've been named house prefects," Hermione said, handing Harry a letter while Ron hands Caden's his. Caden opens his letter and sees the prefect badge, looking up to see Harry shaking his head. "Are you sure? I would have thought you would get one," Hermione said, looking at Caden, who is now looking down at his prefect badge on his palm. "I'm sure. Nothing," Harry said, happy that Caden for his prefect badge at least. "So, congratulations, Caden, Ron, Hermione." "Well, thanks, Harry," Hermione said. "Come on, let's go back downstairs," Ron said, looking at Caden, who shook his head at him. "Yes, do go enjoy yourselves," Harry said, laying down on his bed away from them, hearing them leave except Caden. "It's just a badge, Harry," Caden said, placing the prefect badge on the bedside table. "At least for me." he said, going back to his writing. 39. Caden, Elias, and Malia exit the Hogwarts Express and move quickly through the crowd of students to the carriages that would take them to the castle. As they prepare to climb into one of the carriages, Caden stops and stares towards the front of the carriage. There is a large reptilian, horse-like creature harnessed to the front, whereas always before there was nothing. Thestral? Caden questioned, pointing at the creature. What? Elias asked, looking at where Caden is pointing but sees nothing. They're Thestral, Caden said, turning his head to look at Elias. You see them when you've witnessed death, he said, clambering into the carriage. It starts moving when they all sit down. Caden looks out into the darkness of the Hogwarts grounds. He looks at Hagrid's hut in the dark. All the lights are off within. Hagrid's cabin looks deserted, Caden said, looking at Malia in front of him, who is sitting on the opposite side of him. I hope he's all right, Malia said. What if he were still on his mission from Dumbledore? Elias asked. Yeah, could be, Caden said, looking down at his hands. Hogwarts headmaster, Professor Dumbledore, a wizened old man with a great white beard to his belt and long white hair, stands to address the school. I beg a few moments of your attention, as I have a few starts of term announcements. Right off, our caretaker, the good Mr. Filch, has reminded me for what he says is the 462nd time that he had annually updated list of various banned items, usually introduced by our humor experts Fred and George Weasley. Professor Dumbledore said. Fred and George stand and take a bow to the cheering, laughter, and yells, which are posted in an extensive list on the door to Mr. Filch's door. Caden shares a smile with Elias, who was grinning. Also, we have 2 staffing changes this year. Professor Grubbyplank will be taking the post of Care of Magical Creatures post as Professor Hagrid is on extended leave, Professor Dumbledore said. Additionally, we have Professor Umbridge, who has kindly agreed to fill the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts. At this, Umbridge stands and clears her throat. Headmaster, if I could address the school? Professor Dumbledore looks taken aback. Professor McGonagall glares at Umbridge. Professor Dumbledore sits down and invites Umbridge forward. Thank you, Headmaster. Now, how are we all doing tonight? I thought I would just say a few words. I am here at the Ministry of Magic's bequest under Educational Decree 22, which states that if the headmaster of Hogwarts is unable to fill any teaching post, the ministry shall select one for the position. Professor Dumbledore inclines his head. There is murmuring from the students. The ministry has always considered the magical education of our children to be of vital importance, and the passing down of this ancient and noble art must be given to the next generation, lest it be lost forever. Umbridge said. Without progress, stagnation. But progress for progress's sake is to be discouraged, for our art requires no tinkering. She said, a balance must be attained, the new and the old, permanence and change, tradition and innovation, order and chaos. She said, there are large changes coming soon, changes walking the fine line between order and chaos. Know only that these changes are for the best, and to prevent the destruction of our civilization from its own decay. Thank you. Umbridge smiles at them all, but to Caden and Harry, the smiles seem a little forced, a little fake. And Caden has a feeling that he should be holding Harry back from speaking about Voldemort in front of her. Thankfully, the Hufflepuff house and Ravenclaw house believe that Voldemort is back. Caden didn't turn around when the door was pushed open by Harry, already knowing this will happen. Sorry, Professor, Harry said. Umbridge smiles, toad-like, at Harry. Let's see, 5 points from Gryffindor for coming in late. Caden watches Harry sit down next to Ron and Hermione, close enough for him to stop Harry if he starts speaking about Voldemort. Harry turns his head when he notices him looking, raising his eyebrows in question, but Caden looks away. Now, as I was saying before Mr. Potter interrupted with his antics, your defense against the dark arts education has been rather fragmented and disjointed in your last classes, hasn't it? Umbridge said. Know that this is about to be rectified. I will be following a pre-approved ministry-prepared, theory-centered defense lesson plan, she said, waving her wand at the blackboard, and words are written down on it. Copy this down. Caden opens his books and begins copying what was on the blackboard, except Hermione, who sits with her book unopened, her hand in the air, frowning when Umbridge ignores her. However, within the next few seconds, nearly the whole class is watching Hermione. Umbridge sighs. Yes? I wanted to know something about your course aims, Hermione said, placing her hand down. Well, they should be perfectly self-evident. Umbridge said, well, I don't think they are. They say nothing about actually doing spells. Hermione said, confused. Umbridge laughs. I can imagine no circumstance in my class where you would need to use spells, my dear. But surely the whole point of defense against the dark arts is practical application? Hermione said. Miss Granger, this class has been approved by ministry experts. Are you a ministry expert? Umbridge asked. No, but then you have no business challenging those who are. We will be learning about spells in a safe, risk-free environment, but we've got OWLS coming up. You expect us to do spells with no practice? Hermione questioned, disbelief. What good's theory in the real world? Harry asked, not noticing Caden taking a deep breath. This is school, not the real world, Mr. Potter. There is nothing out there waiting to get you. Umbridge said. What about Lord Voldemort? Harry asked, causing the whole class, except Caden, to flinch at the sound of the name. 10 points from Gryffindor, Mr. Potter. Let me set the record straight, Umbridge said, standing behind her desk, leaning on her knuckles. Some of you have been told that a certain dead wizard has returned. This is a lie. Harry was about to stand up, but he was stopped by Caden, who dragged him back down to his chair. Harry turns his head to look at Caden, face changing at the begging emotions in his twin brother's eyes. Harry looks at Umbridge, noticing the expectant look, and leans back, not giving her the expectations to give him detention and probably do something horrible. Caden looks at the disappointed expression Umbridge tries to hide, letting go of Harry's hand and leaning back on his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. Just like he thought, Umbridge wanted to punish him and Harry for speaking out about Voldemort. He knows it's bad to wish people death, but he hopes Umbridge got killed. 40. Caden walks with Cedric down the corridor, finally alone for the first time. Cedric is quiet, thinking about something inside his mind while Caden is wondering about Victor. When do you think he'll arrive? Caden said, looking at Cedric, who broke out of his thoughts and looked down at him. Probably tomorrow, Cedric said, shrugging, wrapping his arm around Caden's shoulders. You should stop blaming yourself, Caden, he said, kissing his boyfriend's cheek. Don't you? Caden asked, looking up at Cedric, who shook his head. No, Cedric said, smiling. You didn't do anything, Cade, he said. It's my father's choice to speak out about Voldemort. Caden nods, looking away from Cedric. He still feels guilty for making Amos lose his job. Though, if he hadn't given Cedric his ring, Cedric would have died in that graveyard. Hey, Cedric said, suddenly stopping them from walking, gaining Caden's attention, who looked up at him. Look who's here, he said, turning his head to look at the approaching Bulgarian. Caden turns his head, his confused frown turning into a smile when he sees Victor walking towards them. He moves out of Cedric's arm and wraps his arms around Victor, who wraps his arms around him. Caden pulls away, letting Cedric hug Victor. You knew about this, didn't you? He asked, looking at Cedric, who pulls away from Victor and smiles at Caden. Maybe, Cedric said, shrugging. But who knows, right? Victor chuckles, shaking his head softly. Looks like I came at the right time, he said in a Bulgarian accent. Though it seems like he has been studying English, seeing as he's speaking quickly rather than slowly like last year when he's carefully looking for words to say. You did, Cedric said, jerking his head behind him. Come on, you must be hungry. Victor nods, walking on the other side of Caden as they begin walking towards the Great Hall. As soon as he entered the Great Hall, he was instantly met with shocked and amazed expression. He walks towards the Hufflepuff table, following his boyfriends. Victor sat himself down next to Caden, while Cedric sat next on the other side of Caden. Elias and Malia are sitting in front of them, looking at Victor with confusion on their faces. Victor looks at the tall table, nodding to the headmaster, who raised his cup in greeting. How did this happen? Elias asked, looking at Caden and Cedric for an answer. Are you staying at Hogwarts? Malia asked, looking at Victor. Only for this year, unfortunately. Victor answered, turning to look at Elias. My parents thought it was a good idea for me to stay close with Caden and Cedric, he said, looking at his boyfriends who were eating their food while still listening to him. And then I got Dumbledore's permission, he said, turning away from his boyfriends. And here I am. Elias and Malia nod, eating their food again. Victor ignores all the looks he's getting and begins eating as well, humming at the feeling of his empty stomach being filled with food. Caden has his head on Victor's chest, fast asleep. Victor is sleeping on his bed with his arm around him while Cedric is sleeping in his own bed. He starts dreaming again, already knowing that Harry is having the same thing. They stroll along the darkened corridor, passing the many gray doors. There is only one door that interests them. It lies at the end of the long hall, pure white light shining through the gap between the door and the jamb. They move towards it, bathed in shining light. They reach out their hand and grasp the handle. It is locked. They shake the handle and hit the door. Caden's eyes snap open, looking up at Victor, who is still asleep peacefully. He placed his head back down on Victor's chest, going back to sleep. Hermione opens her edition of the Daily Prophet and sits up in alarm. I cannot believe it. Caden, Harry, Ron, Cedric, and Victor glance at her in question. Hermione slaps the paper down on the table. Ron leans forward and looks at the Daily Prophet. Ministry passes Educational Decree number 23. Dolores Umbridge appointed Hogwarts High Inquisitor? He looks at them. What's that mean? A High Inquisitor has the power to inspect all of the teachers. Victor said. You're kidding. Caden and Harry said. That's not all. The High Inquisitor also has the power to sack teachers as well, Hermione said. Fred and George march by. So, seen the news, have you? Fred asked. Personally, I envy you for. George said. Why's that? Ron questioned. Umbridge is inspecting McGonagall in your period. That old toad won't know what hit her. George said as he looks at Fred wistfully. Oh, to be a youth again. To experience the innocent glee of watching Umbridge be destroyed by the greatest head of Gryffindor this century. Well, we'll expect a full report after. Fred said, complete with facial expressions. George said, walking off with Fred. Do they always do that? Victor asked, looking at them. Yes. Caden said, they do. Professor Trelawney stands before her class. Greetings, my children. I sense even now that many of you have already made the transition into the beyond. Umbridge smiles, toad-like. Today, we will be continuing our interpretation of prophetic dreams. Please divide into your groups and discuss your recent nighttime visions using the text as a guide. Caden opened his book while listening to Professor Trelawney and Umbridge talking. And how long have you been at this post? Umbridge asked. Near to 16 years, I have been the guide to young seers possessed of the inner sight. Professor Trelawney said. Umbridge makes a note. I understand you are the descendant of the famous seer Cassandra Trelawney? I am. Professor Trelawney said. And you are the first since Cassandra to have the second sight? Umbridge asked. These things tend to skip several generations. Professor Trelawney said. Of course. Umbridge said, making another note. Now, if you would kindly make a prediction for me? Professor Trelawney looks at Caden. My dear boy, what do you see about her? She said, as you were the only one to have reached the inner eye. Caden squints his eyes at Umbridge, who is waiting for his response with an already smug smile. Everyone is as well. You're gonna be attacked by a herd of centaur, he said, watching Umbridge's smile fall down at that. Don't insult the centaurs, and the sight will happen, he said, blinking, looking down at his book again. Wonderful, dear boy. Professor Trelawney said. What a sight you have, she said, looking away from Caden to look at Umbridge, who is narrowing her eyes at the Hufflepuff. 41. Hermione, Ron, Harry, and Caden walk down the crowded streets of Hogsmeade, avoiding the swarms of other students. Where are we going, Hermione? Harry asked, glancing at Caden, who is strangely without his boyfriends, looking away when Caden looks up from the ground. She leads them on confidently and stops before a slightly seedy-looking pub, making them stop as well. There we are. The Hog's Head, Hermione? Ron questioned. Hermione leads them towards it. Come on, I'll explain in a minute. The four of them step into the pub. It is grimy and ill-lit. Shady witches and wizards sit uneasily in corners. Except for one corner by the front window, which is populated by Dean Thomas, Neville Longbottom, Harper Gallagher, Lavender Brown, Parvati and Padma Patil, Cho Chong, Luna Lovegood, Katie Bell, Alicia Spinett, Angelina Johnson, Colin and Dennis Creevy, Ernie McMillan, Justin Finch Fletchley, Hannah Abbott, Anthony Goldstein, Michael Corner, Terry Boot, Ginny Weasley, Fred and George Weasley, Lee Jordan, Zacharias Smith, Susan Bones, Michael Corner, Elias, and Malia. Cedric and Victor are with them as well, talking with Justin and Susan about something. Harry looks questioningly at Hermione. Hermione, what's going on? These are some people I mentioned my defense against the dark arts with, Hermione said, sitting down. Caden, Harry, and Ron sit down as well. You mean about us teaching ourselves? Harry asked. Hey, Harry, Neville said. Hey, Neville, Harry said back, nodding. It's good to see that the horned snorkel stacks haven't gotten you both yet, Luna said dreamily. Harry looks confused, looking at Caden, who didn't even look confused. You too, Luna, Caden said, smiling at the girl who returns the smile. Hermione beats on the table to quiet everyone. Hi, everyone. I thought it would be good if we met and talked over how we wanted to teach ourselves defense against the dark arts, she said. Because we need to learn it properly, not the rubbish Umbridge is doing. Here, Fred exclaimed. Obviously, this will help us pass our OWLS, but more importantly, it gives us the ability to protect ourselves from Lord Voldemort, Hermione said after a few seconds of hesitation. Several people jump or wince in fear at the name. Hermione takes a shuddering breath, looking exhilarated. She looks at Caden and Harry. That's the first time you've said his name, Harry said, while Caden gives her two thumbs up with a proud smile on his face. Hermione looks pleased by both actions from the brothers. How do we know you know who's really back? Zacharias asked. Dumbledore believes he is, George answered. You mean Dumbledore believes him? Justin said, nodding in Caden's direction. That's true, but I think we're drifting from the purpose. It's okay, Hermione, Caden said, stopping her from talking further, looking at the crowd. I believe Voldemort's back because I saw him last year. Cedric was there as well. Dumbledore's already told the school that. If you don't believe him, are you going to trust the Ministry, who is the reason why we're here right now? There is a tense silence, not knowing what to say. Cedric and Victor smile at his words, supportive of everything their boyfriend is going to say. Well, anyway, I think that in order to learn properly we'll need a teacher, Hermione said. But we're all students. None of us has the experience to. Someone here does, Ginny said, cutting Neville's words off. Everyone looks at her, who is staring at Caden and Harry. Us? Harry questioned, glancing at Caden, who shrugs at him. He knows more spells than me, he said, and Caden raised his eyebrows at that. I for one would like to know why Potter's qualified and the rest of us aren't, Michael said. Well, Harry's only confronted who himself 3 times and lived to talk about it, Ginny said defensively. Caden fought who and won. One of the portraits said you'd killed a basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets with that sword in Dumbledore's office. Susan said. He did, Caden answered, smiling proudly at Harry, who has a small smile on his face. Blimey, Harry, Lee Jordan said. Half the crowd looks awestruck. Wow, Lavender said. Can't forget that Harry saved the Sorcerer's Stone from you-know-who in his first year, Fred said. The Patil sisters' eyes are wide with respect and astonishment. And last year Caden got through the Triwizard Tournament, Cho exclaimed. Not to mention Caden created a spell and dueled with who all alone, and he still couldn't kill you, Ron said. And they fought off those Dementors that attacked you both this summer, Ginny said. Harry's eyes widened with surprise, looking at Caden, who looked back at him. He didn't know Caden got attacked by the Dementors too. So all in favor of taking lessons from Caden and Harry? Hermione asked, holding up her hand. Half of the people raised their hand, but after a moment the others raised theirs as well. Where are we going to meet? I have a place, Caden said before someone could speak out, gaining their full attention. There's this room called the Come and Go room, he said, looking at Hermione. I use it to practice my spells a long time ago. We could use it. Is there another name for it? Malia asked. Room of Requirement, Caden said, shrugging, turning his head to look at Harry. What do you think? That might work, Harry said, nodding. Okay, good, Hermione said, pulling out a parchment out of her bag. I think we should put our names down, so we know who was here. Suddenly, people look uncomfortable. I don't know. If it were found, I mean, Umbridge wouldn't like what we're doing, Ernie said. Honestly, Ernie, do you think I'd just leave it lying around? Besides, it's enchanted, Hermione said. Ernie looks more comfortable. Fred and George eagerly sign, as do the rest. Even Cho's friend Marietta signs. Also, what should we call ourselves? Hermione asked. What about the Anti-Umbrid League? Angelina asked. We need something that doesn't give away what we're doing, Hermione said, looking at Caden. Have any idea what we should name ourselves, Caden? Caden looked surprised by her question, not expecting it. You always have something in your mind, Hermione explained, shrugging, and she was correct when Caden instantly answered her first question. The Silver Circle. Hermione smiles, looking at everyone who seems to be satisfied with the name. The Silver Circle it is, then. Silver's for short, she said. We'll let you know when we're going to meet. 42. Caden ran towards Harry, helping him up from the ground. Are you all right? He asked, wiping down the dirt on Harry's clothes. Bet you loved that, Potter. Saved by Weasley's neck, didn't you? Draco said, making Caden roll his eyes. I've never seen a worse keeper. Maybe we should add some more verses to our little song. About his filthy mother. George tries to leap at Draco, but is held back by Harry and Fred. And his pathetic loser of a FA. Draco's words were cut off by Caden, who punched him hard, knocking him back onto his butt. Draco looks up at Caden with surprise, eyes wide, not expecting Caden to do that. Enough, Malfoy. Caden's words were sharp enough to cut diamonds. His eyes are narrowed on Malfoy. You too as well, he hissed, snapping his head to Crabbe and Goyle, who stopped on their feet. The Gryffindors and Slytherins are quiet, having not expected Caden to punch the blonde, who is still looking up at Caden with widened eyes. Caden looks up at the approaching footsteps of Professor McGonagall and Madame Hooch, backing away from Malfoy, who is now in disbelief at losing his friendship with Caden. What's happening? Madame Hooch asked, looking at Caden and Malfoy, who is still on the ground. Malfoy insulted the Weasleys, ma'am, Victor said, standing next to Caden while Cedric talks with Harry, Fred, and George to calm them down. Madame Hooch sighs, looking down at Malfoy. Caden turns around and walks towards the three with his boyfriend, turning to Harry, who is glaring at Malfoy. Don't give her the satisfaction, Harry, he said when he's close enough to his twin brother. Umbridge is gonna ban you three from Quidditch if you beat him up, he said, looking at the Weasleys twins. And how do you know this? Fred asked, taking a deep breath. Caden shrugs. The sight, he said. I believe her, unlike some people. Harry looks over Caden's shoulder, catching sight of Umbridge looking at them with narrowed eyes. His face changed when he noticed the disappointed expression that she tried to hide, turning his head to look at Caden, who raised his eyebrows at him. He watches Caden turn his head to look at Umbridge, and she instantly walks away. Caden stands still with his wand in his hands, looking at the assembled group that makes up the Silver Circle. Glad to see all of you could find this place all right, he said, looking at Harry, who strolls into the room, standing next to him. Hey, Caden, what is all this stuff? Neville asked. Scattered around the room are many devices such as dark detectors and sneakoscopes. Defense against the dark arts equipment, Caden answered, used to the stuff around the room. Hopefully we'll be able to get to all of it before the end of term, he said, looking at Harry and nod, giving him the lead. You need to understand something before we start, though. Defending yourself from the dark arts has less to do with magical ability and more to do with thinking fast and a lot of luck, Harry said. We'll be doing Expelliarmus tonight, though hopefully we can move on to other things if we have time. Oh, please. Professor Lockhart taught us that in second year, Zacharias said. He taught us nothing except to buy his books, Caden said, rolling his eyes. And he acts like a creep to the girls' students, he muttered, crossing his arms. I'll teach you all sustenendum and presidium in the next lesson, he said, looking at them who all seemed satisfied by that. Right. Well, let's split into pairs and give it a go, Harry said, smiling at the silent Zacharias. Caden strolls among the students amid shouts of Expelliarmus, checking everyone's form. Harry is doing the same thing as him. Caden almost flinched when arms wrapped around his waist, dragging him back. He smiles at the feeling of lips on his neck, turning around in Victor's arms to look up at him. What can I help you with? He asked, pecking his boyfriend's lips. Miss you, Victor said, smiling against Caden's lips as he starts kissing him. Someone clears their throat behind Caden, making him pull away from Victor and looks at Hermione, who is looking at them with a small smirk. We're here to practice spells, you know, Hermione said, amused at the blush covering Caden's face. Yeah, Vic, we're here to practice spells, Caden said, patting Victor's cheek and walking away from them before they could voice out on his blush. Don't distract him, Victor, Hermione said, letting out a small laugh. He's the one easily distracted, Victor said, shrugging. Hermione shakes her head, smiling. Come on, someone needs help. Victor nods and follows Hermione, stroking Caden's shoulders as they pass by him. He smiles when Caden smiles at him. Caden lies in bed with Victor under him again, dreaming again. We float along a dark corridor, inches from the floor. We come to another corridor and peer down it. It appears empty. A great python of a snake slithers down the empty corridor. It slowly makes its way past many doors until it reaches, at last, another, larger door. Behind it, an invisibility cloak falls to the floor in a shimmer of silver. Mr. Weasley stands, drawing his wand. He fires a golden jinx at the snake. He misses. The snake strikes. Mr. Weasley screams. Caden yells at the top of his lungs, eyes tightly closed, waking Cedric and Victor up from his screaming. He makes biting motions with his mouth, snarking madly. A seizure takes him. He screams in rage and horror, his entire bed shaking with his thrashing. Cedric and Victor tried to wake him up, but couldn't. The snake strikes Mr. Weasley again and again. Blood splatters against the walls and floor. Mr. Weasley screams again. Elias leaps out of his bed, looking at the three of them. Caden screams again, an unearthly sound of horror, anguish, and bloodlust. What's wrong with him? Elias asked, approaching the three. Caden screams again. His eyes snap open and they are pure white, without pupils. He makes the bidding motion again, thrashing wildly. Get Sprout. Go! Cedric exclaimed. Elias turns and runs out of the dorm. The snake strikes again. Mr. Weasley, eyes flicking everyone and seeing nothing, staggers into the wall and falls to the ground, leaving a bloody smear to mark his descent. The snake abandons the door and slithers away at top speed. Caden still struggles madly. Caden! Cade! Cedric exclaimed. Caden blinks, and his eyes are normal. He comes to himself, only to let out a shriek of burning agony. He clutches at his right arm, eyes crossing and unable to focus. He rolls off the bed and onto the floor, where he writhes in abject pain. Elias returns with Professor Sprout, watching in horror as Caden's right arm starts bleeding. Professor Sprout broke out of her staring. Potter! She runs to him, thrusting her candle into Elias' hands. She falls to her knees next to Caden and tries to touch him. Her hand touches his skin and she yelps as if burnt. She backs off. Caden vomits all over the floor. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Caden slumps over, unmoving. Professor Sprout is at his side in an instant. She rolls him over. His eyes are closed. Wake up, Potter. Wake up, please. Caden's eyes open. He sits up, looking frantic. Mr. Weasley's been attacked. You dreamed this, Potter? Professor Sprout asked. No, I saw it happen. We were there, Caden said. We're going to see the headmaster, Potter, Professor Sprout said, looking at Cedric and Victor, who is looking at Caden with concern. You two can come with. 43. The group with Professor Sprout met up with Professor McGonagall's group, walking together towards Dumbledore's office. Professor Dumbledore looks up from where he is seated at this desk. Professor McGonagall, Professor Sprout, and he does not look at Caden and Harry, or even acknowledge their presence. What can I do for you? Well, both Potters have had some kind of nightmare, Professor McGonagall said. It wasn't a nightmare. Well, we were asleep, but it wasn't a normal dream. It was, well, real. We saw, well, Mr. Weasley has been attacked by a giant snake. Harry was confused why Caden didn't jump in his talking, glancing at Caden, who was blankly looking at the floor. How did you see this? How were you positioned when you saw it? Professor Dumbledore asked. We were the snake. We saw it from the snake's perspective. Harry answered. Is Arthur seriously injured? Professor Dumbledore asked.
Yes,
Harry exclaimed, glancing away from Caden, who didn't look up from the floor. Professor Dumbledore stands and looks up at the portraits of previous headmasters and headmistresses of Hogwarts. Two of them are watching the proceedings. You were listening? Naturally, Everard said. Raise the alarm. We must make sure Arthur is found by the right people. Professor Dumbledore said. Everard and Dillies move out of their frames and do not return. Many of our previous headmasters and mistresses have portraits in other institutions, allowing them to move between them. Professor Dumbledore said, motioning for all of them to sit. He moves to Fawkes. Fawkes, we will need a warning. The phoenix vanishes in a blast of fire. Professor Dumbledore sits back at his desk and pulls a silvery, whirring instrument to him. It emits some smoke that forms itself into the shape of a serpent, then splits in two. The two serpents coil around each other. Naturally, Professor Dumbledore said, but in essence divided? Harry, Ron, and Cedric exchange confused looks, while Victor has his arm wrapped around Caden's shoulders, who is now looking at his hands. Everard returns to his portrait. What news? Professor Dumbledore said. I shouted until someone came. They carried him up seconds ago. He doesn't look good. Covered in blood. Everard said. Dillies returns to her portrait at this time. Dumbledore, I've just seen them arrive at St. Mungo's. Apparated there moments ago. He looks really bad. Good. Professor Dumbledore said, turning to Professor McGonagall. Minerva, the rest of the Weasleys will need to be awoken. Professor McGonagall nods and departs. Professor Dumbledore again turns to the portraits hanging on the wall. Phineas. Phineas Black opens his eyes and stares at Dumbledore. Phineas, I need you to visit your other portrait. Tell Sirius what happened and that we are coming to stay for a while. Professor Dumbledore said. It's late, Dumbledore. Phineas said. Professor Dumbledore stares at him. I'm going. Phineas said, vanishing. Professor Dumbledore takes a black pot and taps it with his wand. Portus. Professor McGonagall returns with Ginny, Fred, and George in tow. Ginny looks at Caden and Harry with confusion. Caden, Harry, what's happening? Your father has been injured in the course of his work for the Order. He is alive and arrived at St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries only moments ago. Professor Dumbledore picks up the pot and steps around the desk. We, however, are going to Sirius House until this morning. We're merely waiting for Phineas to return. A flash of flames appears over Fawkes' perch. A single feather floats to the ground. Fawkes warning. Umbridge knows you're out of bed. Minerva, Pomona, head her off. Tell her anything you can think of. Professor Dumbledore said. Professor McGonagall and Professor Sprout depart. Phineas returns to his portrait. He says he'd be delighted. I think I'll stay here. Caden said, looking up, talking for the first time. I don't think it's a good idea for me to be at Sirius House. He said, standing up, Victor following his movement. Is there something you would like to tell us before we leave, Mr. Potter? Professor Dumbledore asked, looking at Caden, glancing at Victor, who is whispering something into the Hufflepuff's ear. Caden shakes his head after listening to Victor, looking at Professor Dumbledore. No, sir, he said. I'm just tired, he said, glancing up at Victor. Victor will be here with me. Cedric, you go and tell me everything, he said, turning to look at Cedric, who nodded at him with a grim expression. Cedric moves towards Caden and kisses him on the forehead. Nodding to Victor, who returns the gesture, moving again to stand next to Harry. "We're going by portkey," Professor Dumbledore said. They all grab the pot and vanish. Caden looks up at Victor, a small frown on his face. "What do I do?" Victor cupped Caden's cheeks, looking into the blue eyes. "We'll figure something out, Caden," he said, giving Caden a small smile. "Let's go back to sleep." Caden nods, taking Victor's hand, and follows him out of Dumbledore's office and towards the Hufflepuff common room. Caden and Harry enter Severus' office. Severus sits behind his desk, next to a pensive. "Sit," Severus said, nodding to the two chairs. Caden and Harry sit down. Caden is fiddling with his right sleeve shirt again, only stopping when Severus looks his way. "As you are well aware, I will be teaching you both Occlumency. The headmaster feels you should learn this form of magic to defend yourself against the Dark Lord, who is skilled at legilimency," Severus said. "What's that, Professor?" Harry asked. "Legilimency is the ability to extract thoughts and feelings from others," Severus said, glancing at Caden. "Voldemort can read minds?" Harry asked. "As usual, you have all the subtlety of a stone wall, Potter," Severus said. "The mind is not a book, of which any page can be examined. The mind is complex and multi-layered." "So he could read our minds right now?" Harry asked. "Eye contact is normally required for legilimency to work. In your case, however, things are somewhat different. Your scar and blood has forged a connection between you and the Dark Lord," Severus said. "When your mind is most relaxed, such as during sleep, you receive the Dark Lord's thoughts and feelings. The headmaster believes that it is inadvisable for this to continue. But hasn't it helped so far? I mean, it saved Mr. Weasley's life, didn't it?" Harry asked. "Yes, it did, but at the expense of our advantage. The connection between you both was so powerful during your vision of the snake that the Dark Lord became aware of it. The headmaster fears that he may try to use this to his advantage, to manipulate you through false visions," Severus said, standing and pulling out his wand. Harry flinches, ever so slightly. But Severus merely puts it to his head and draws a glowing string of memory from his head and drops it into the pensieve. "Wand out, Caden," Severus said, looking at Caden. Caden draws his wand. "You may use any spell you can think of to try and repel me," Severus said. "What are you going to do?" Harry asked, scared for his twin brother. "I am going to break into his mind," Severus said, and without warning, points his wand at Caden. "Legimens." The spell hits Caden, who staggers backward, but quickly puts a stop to Severus before he could look into his mind. "You will need to practice more," Severus said, nodding to Caden, who sits back down. He turns to Harry. "Repel me with your mind," he said. "Clear your mind, Potter. Abandon your emotions." "Legilimens." Harry staggers back, showing him multiple memories. Caden looks up at Severus, who lowers his wand, breaking the spell on Harry. "What was that?" Severus asked, looking at Caden. Harry looks stunned. "I've just realized." Severus is staring at Harry, agitated. "Realized what, Potter?" Harry looks at Professor Snape suddenly. "What's in the Department of Mysteries, sir?" There is a stunned silence. Severus regards Harry with suspicion. "What did you say?" "That corridor. We've been dreaming about it for months. It leads to the Department of Mysteries. I'm sure of it," Harry said. Severus comes around the desk. He is deathly quiet, always a bad sign. "There are many things in the Department of Mysteries, Potter, none of which concern you." There is a horrifying scream that echoes through the castle. Caden, Harry, and Severus stare at the ceiling. Severus glances at Caden and Harry, then hefts his wand and sweeps from the office. Caden and Harry were quick to follow after him. 44. There is a huge crowd of students standing at the top of the stairs leading down into the entry hall. There is another unearthly wail. Caden and Harry push their way through the crowd until they can see. Professor Trelawney stands at the bottom of the stairs, looking crazed and turning in circles, her wand out and clutched in her hand. "You cannot sack me. I can do whatever I wish," Umbridge said. "This is my home," Professor Trelawney cries out. Umbridge grins evilly. "Not anymore," she said, pointing at the door with a stubby finger. "Now remove yourself from this castle, Behind Umbridge, the crowd parts slowly, and Dumbledore moves down the steps. She will not be leaving. I have the authority, Headmaster, Umbridge exclaimed. Oh, I agree with you, Professor Umbridge. You do have the power to dismiss my teachers. However, Professor Dumbledore said, looking at Professor Trelawney, who stands alone in the entry hall, smiling at Dumbledore through her tears. You cannot send them from this castle. That is still my decision. Professor Trelawney will remain here. Umbridge turns to him, furious. And what of her quarters when I appoint a new teacher? Happily, that will not be necessary. I have found a successor for good Professor Trelawney already. As you know, Professor Dumbledore said, the ministry can only appoint new teachers if I cannot find one. I think you will find him suitable enough. The great oaken doors leading to the grounds swing open, revealing an ebony-skinned centaur. It is Firenze, who saved Harry in his first year. This is Firenze, Professor Dumbledore said, looking at the shocked expression on Umbridge's face. Today, I'm gonna be teaching you all Praesidium and Sustenendum, Caden said, looking at everyone who was looking at him with excited eyes. Both of them? Angelina asked, worried and excited at the same time. I made them into an easy spell, Caden said. Something that you can do even in your first year, he said, glancing at Harry, who nods at him with a smile. He looks at the crowd. Break into a group of 4 and start waving your wand like this. He does the wand movement for Praesidium and then the second one. How do we know we did the spells? Fred asked. Caden blinked for a moment, then he turns to a dummy and waved his wand in front of him, showing the dome of a shield in front of him. And when he pointed his wand at the dummy, the shield moves forward and knocks the dummy down. He does the second spell, and a beam of gold bursts out of his wand, burning the second dummy to crisp. Caden turns to look at the crowd, who is shocked that he didn't even say those spells out loud. These 2 spells will knock them down. The reason the Sustenendum spell is turning the dummy into crisp is because of the cloth. The crowd nodded, relaxed. All right, Caden said, clapping his hands. Go on, for groups, he said, watching the crowd break into 4 groups. He looks at Harry, who is walking towards Ron and Hermione, ignoring the fact that Fred and George are with them as well. The room of requirement is instantly with voices and spells with the color of yellow and blue, some of them satisfied that they successfully conjure the spells. Arms are suddenly wrapped around Caden's waist, bringing his attention away from the crowd to his boyfriends who have been standing behind him, like a bodyguard. How are you feeling? Cedric asked, turning Caden around to look at him. Caden blinks. I'm feeling okay, for now, he said, laying his head on Cedric's chest, watching Victor, who is watching the crowd. How are you two? Victor turns his head to look at Caden, a small smile on his face. We are fine, Lebovnik, he said, watching Caden smile up at him, hiding his face in Cedric's chest, who chuckles in amusement. What are we teaching them next? Cedric asked, looking at the crowd of students practicing spells. Patronus charm, Caden said, moving his head back from Cedric's chest to look at Harry and his group, who is now playing around with each other, making him smile at the sight. He turns his head to look at Victor, who is looking at him with fondness. What's your Patronus, Vic? A falcon. Victor answers without hesitation. What's yours? He asked Cedric. Badger. Cedric answered. Our patron uses match us well? Yeah, they do, Caden said, looking back at Harry, who is laughing at something Fred said. Suddenly, with a crack, Dobby appears. Mr. Caden Potter. He looks absolutely frantic. Caden instantly turns to him, looking at him with concern. What is it, Dobby? The house elf has gone quiet, clamping his hands over his mouth. He stopped, terrified. Who, Dobby? Harry asked, approaching them. Dobby shakes his head. Umbridge? Caden asked, kneeling down to Dobby's height. Dobby nods. Harry looks up, horrified. Dobby forces his arms down and takes a deep breath. She knows, Harry Potter. She's coming. Caden stands up and opens the door with a wave of his wand. All of you out. Now. There is a mad rush to the door. Caden ushers them all out safely and exits himself with Harry behind him. Caden nodded to his boyfriends and told them to leave for the Hufflepuff's common room. He watches them leave with hesitation, but they listen to him anyway. Caden turns his head to look at Harry, nodding to a hallway, where they start running. He stops when Harry is suddenly hit with a spell and falling down to the ground. Malfoy leaps from behind a statue. "Got you, Potters," he said. "Over here, Professor. I've got two." Umbridge hurries over. "It's them. Well done, Draco." She turns to Harry. "On your feet, Potter. We're going to see the headmaster." She turns to Draco. "Search everywhere for the others, Draco. Round them all up. Check everywhere. Bathrooms, the library, empty classrooms. We must find them." Malfoy nods and hurries off, glancing at Caden for a few seconds. 45. Umbridge shoves Caden and Harry into Dumbledore's office, which is filled with people. Professor McGonagall, Cornelius Fudge, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Maya Rosewood, and Percy Weasley. "You may be High Inquisitor of this school, Professor Umbridge, but kindly do not manhandle my students," Professor Dumbledore said. Fudge looks pleased. He claps his hands and rubs them excitedly. Well, Mr. Caden Potter and Mr. Harry Potter. I expect you both know why you're here." Harry glances at Caden and Professor Dumbledore. The headmaster shakes his head, ever so slightly, while Caden shrugs at him. "Not really, no." "You don't? You haven't broken any school rules?" Fudge asked, looking at Caden for an answer. "No," Caden said, shaking his head. "Or ministerial decrees?" Fudge asked again, looking at both Potters. "Not that we know of." Harry answered for both of them. Umbridge opens the door again, leading Marietta into the room. She has been crying, and her face is covered in pimples forming the word sneak. "I'm afraid the poor girl is unable to speak, but I shall tell you what has transpired," Umbridge said. "Shortly after dinner she came to me and said that if I went to the room of requirement, I would find an illegally formed student group. She said it was at that time that this hex took effect." She gestures to Marietta's face. "Since I had received information some time ago that Potters and a number of other students had met in the Hog's Head to start an illegal group." "I'm not sure that's true, Professor," Professor Dumbledore said, stopping her from talking further. "I'm sorry?" Umbridge questioned. "In point of fact, when young Potters met those students, it was not illegal," Professor Dumbledore said. "But 2 days later, Educational Decree 24 was introduced," Umbridge said. "Again, quite correct. However, I wonder if you have any evidence that proves this group has been meeting since then?" Professor Dumbledore asked. "I have a witness right here," Umbridge said, pointing to Marietta. "Correct again. I must confess that I was, however, under the impression that this young girl only told you a meeting was going on tonight," Professor Dumbledore said. "Let's ask her, shall we?" Umbridge said, turning to Marietta, who is staring at the wall. "You can shake your head for an answer, dear. Now, have there been more meetings?" Slowly, still staring at the wall, Marietta shakes her head. "What do you mean by shaking your head, girl?" Umbridge asked. "I would think that she was saying there have been no other meetings. Would that be correct?" Professor Dumbledore asked. Marietta nods. "But what about Potters? They were the leader and have been." To Umbridge's astonishment, Marietta is shaking her head yet again. "Why are you shaking your head, girl?" Umbridge asked. "It usually means no, Dolores," Professor McGonagall said. Umbridge grabs Marietta by the cloak and shakes her roughly. Professor Dumbledore stands, and there is anger in his voice. He draws his wand and points it at Umbridge. "Again, I cannot have you manhandling my students, Professor Umbridge." Umbridge laughs softly and lets Marietta go. "My apologies, Headmaster. I forgot myself." "Well, what about the meeting tonight?" Fudge asked. "Right. Of course. Well, we proceeded down to the room and entered," Umbridge said. "We caught Potters just outside, but it doesn't matter. We found all of their names." She pulls the roster list Hermione had made up from her pocket. Harry gasps at it in horror, while Caden stares at the list with a cocked head. Fudge gaped at it as well. He snatches it out of Umbridge's hands. He looks up, an expression mix of confusion and delight. But then he seems to understand, turning to look at Caden, who has his arms crossed, looking bored. "So, Caden, You've been behind this whole thing. Professor Dumbledore looks confused for a few seconds before that expression disappears. Taking the list, Fudge's hand looks at him. The silver circle. Fudge whispers, looking at Caden as if he had won a lottery. If I were to tell you a secret that could prove Voldemort's back, can you promise me something? Caden asked, glancing at Harry, who seemed confused by what he was planning. We're listening. Maya responds when it seems like nobody will say anything. Don't put me in Azkaban, Caden said, and everyone was stunned by his words, all of them wondering what he's going to do to prove that the Dark Lord is back. The room is silent, none of them not knowing what to say to Caden. But Maya was the first to pull herself together, looking at Caden. We promise, she said, breaking the silence and the stunned group. Rosewoe, we promised, Maya said sternly, sending a look towards Fudge, who looks away from her to Caden, nodding as well. Caden sighs, closing his eyes for a few seconds before opening his eyes, holding up his right hand and starts unbuttoning the sleeve on his left arm. He sees the confused expression on everyone's face, but it quickly disappears when he pulls up his sleeve, revealing the dark mark he had gotten when he had seen Arthur Weasley got attacked. Maya slowly moves towards Caden, taking his left arm into her hands, looking at the dark mark. She brushes her fingers over the mark, watching the snake move at the contact. How long have you had this, Mr. Potter? Professor McGonagall asked, looking at Caden with horror on her face. I got the mark when Mr. Weasley was attacked, Caden answered, looking at the dark mark with silent hatred. I didn't tell anyone because Victor thinks you would put me in Azkaban, he said, looking up and looks at Fudge, who seems nervous under his gaze. And that would put me right into Voldemort's arms. Who else knows about this, Mr. Potter? Professor Dumbledore asked, breaking the silence. Elias, Cedric, Victor, and Professor Sprout, Caden answered without any hesitation. You didn't tell? No, Caden said, cutting Fudge's words off. Now, do you still believe that Voldemort's not back? Fudge seems stunned, not knowing what to do or say. But Umbridge does. She starts making her way towards him and grabs his Caden by the cloak and shakes him roughly. You take off those spells this instant, Potter. Caden looks at Umbridge as she stops shaking him, Maya letting go of his arm to try and stop Umbridge from doing anything dumb. Professor Umbridge, I promised them that I will prove Voldemort's back while revealing the dark mark to them, he said. But I will not hesitate to use a killing curse on you, he said, looking up at the stunned Umbridge. Do you want that? He asked, cocking his head. Umbridge doesn't respond. Let go of me, Caden said, pushing Umbridge's hands off that are still on him. He looks at Fudge, who is now looking at Professor Dumbledore. Coward, he said, gaining Fudge's attention, but the man ignores him. Professor Dumbledore looks at Caden and nods to him, who returns the gesture with a bit of hesitation and grabs onto Fawkes' tail, and the two vanish in a blast of fire. Find him, Fudge exclaimed. Umbridge, Percy, Kingsley, and Fudge race from the office. Maya and Professor McGonagall ushers Caden, Harry, and Marietta out of the office. 46. Caden sits in between Cedric and Victor at the Hufflepuff's table, heads turned towards Umbridge. Umbridge stands up from the staff table, holding a parchment. By order of the Ministry of Magic, Dolores Jane Umbridge will replace Albus Dumbledore as head of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She looks over them all smugly. My first act as your new headmistress is to form an inquisitional squad, led by Draco Malfoy. They will report directly to me about the goings-on in the halls of this school. Furthermore, our good caretaker, Mr. Filch, has requested we reinstate the old punishments. I have decided that there is no reason we shouldn't, Umbridge said. Mr. Filch stands at the back of the hall, grinning like a kid at Christmas. Victor looks at Caden, noticing that his sleeves is rolled up, revealing the dark mark to everyone in the hall, who keeps staring at Caden like he's some kind of monster. Well, some of them are staring at him. Some of them are staring at Caden with sympathy. Victor breaks out of his thoughts when a hand is placed on top of his, looking at Caden, who gives him a small smile, of which he returns. What were you thinking about? Caden asked, gaining Cedric's attention from his voice. They keep staring at you, Victor said, voicing out his concerns for his boyfriend. I don't like it, he said, sighing. Caden smiles, leaning up to kiss Victor at the edge of his lips, making the Bulgarian smile at the contact. "Me too," he said, looking at Cedric, who smiles down at him. He places his hand on top of Cedric as well, smiling at them both. "It'll all be over soon," he said, glancing at Harry when his boyfriend was not looking at him. "It'll all be over soon. Closer than he thinks." Caden enters Professor McGonagall's office. She sits behind her desk. Umbridge sits in the corner with a notepad. "Please sit, Potter," Professor McGonagall said. Caden sits on the chair, making himself comfortable by leaning back. "You're here to have a talk with me about your career thoughts, Potter. We do this so we can begin to aim your courses over the next 2 years to prepare you for that career," Professor McGonagall said. Caden nods. "I'm thinking of being an Auror. Auror interesting, Potter. You'll need top grades for that. Challenging career path, but not unrewarding," Professor McGonagall said, smiling internally at the thought of both Potters working side by side together. Him, Umbridge said, but both Caden and Professor McGonagall ignored her. "Now then, Potter, you'll need to concentrate on defense against the dark arts, potions, transfiguration, and charms to adequately prepare yourself for the general Auror requirements," Professor McGonagall said, repeating the words she had said to Harry to Caden. Him, Umbridge said again, and Caden had to roll his eyes at that. "May I offer you a cough drop, Professor Umbridge?" Professor McGonagall asked, holding back a smile from Caden's action. "Oh, no thank you, Minerva. Actually, I was just wondering if Potter has the proper temperament to be an Auror," Umbridge said. "Were you indeed?" Professor McGonagall said, turning back to Caden. "If you're serious in this ambition, Potter, I would recommend concentrating on bringing your potions and charms grades up more before your OWLS. I dare say you've got enough time if you apply yourself. Lord knows you've consistently done well in defense against the dark arts." Professor Lupin. "Excuse me, Minerva, but have you seen my note on Potter's current grades in my class?" Umbridge asked, cutting Professor McGonagall's sentences. "Yes, indeed I have," Professor McGonagall said. "Then I think you will find that Potter's grades have been consistently—" "You apparently misunderstood me. I meant that Potter has done well in every defense against the dark arts class that has not tried to change his grades to fail him," Professor McGonagall said, cutting Umbridge's words off. She turns back to Caden, who has his eyes narrowed on Umbridge. Umbridge looks as though she cannot believe her ears, then flips a page on her notepad and scribbles furiously. "Now, assuming you've passed all of your necessary classes, the Ministry will put you through a number of character and aptitude tests," Professor McGonagall said. "What's involved in them?" Caden asked. "How you stand up under pressure, your perseverance and dedication, things of this nature," Professor McGonagall said. Umbridge stands up abruptly. "Caden and Harry Potter have no chance of ever becoming an Auror." Professor McGonagall stands as well, her eyes locked with Caden's. "I will assist you both in becoming an Auror if it is the very last thing I do, Potter. I will coach you and Harry nightly in order to get the necessary grades." Umbridge storms from the room. "This concludes our meeting, Potter," Professor McGonagall said, calming down, smiling at him. Caden smiles back. "Thanks, Professor." "You're welcome, Potter. Now hurry, or you both will be late for Occlumency." Much less than degree, much greater than Caden and Harry sit down in front of Severus' office. "Have you both been practicing?" Severus asked. "Yeah," Harry said while Caden nodded. "Well, we shall see, won't we?" Severus asked, placing his wand tip to his head and extracting that same memory and placing it in the pensieve. Just then, the door opens and Malfoy steps in. "Excuse me, Professor. Professor Umbridge says she needs you right away." "What on earth for?" Severus asked. "Well, sir, remember when Montague vanished over Christmas? She says he's turned up in a toilet on the 4th floor." Malfoy said. "Any idea how he got there?" Severus asked. "He's pretty confused, but I think he said something about the vanishing closet." Malfoy said. Severus stands irritably. "We will pick your remedial potions lesson up tomorrow, Potter." Malfoy sniggers, leaving with Severus behind him. Caden looks down at his lap, watching his hands move. "Don't do it, Harry," he said, not looking up from his hands. "Aren't you interested in what memory he drew?" "No," Caden answered without hesitation, looking up from his hands. I'm not interested. If he wanted to, he would tell me. He said. Sirius would be angry with you. Harry turns around, putting his head into the pensieve. Caden sighs, closing his eyes, enjoying the silence around the room. Soon after, the door is opened and Sirius walks in, looking at him first, at the empty seat beside him, and looks at the pensieve. Sirius yanks on the arm. Having fun, Potter? Harry shakes his head, but Sirius shakes him roughly, fury etched in his every feature. Been enjoying yourself? Sirius asked. No, Harry exclaimed, looking at Caden, expecting him to stop Sirius, but he only looks at him with a, I told you so, look, making him look away. Amusing man, your father. Sirius' lips are shaking, his teeth bared. He shakes Harry again, absolutely seething. Sorry, Harry exclaimed. Sirius picks Harry up off the floor and flings him away from him. Harry slams into a potions cabinet and falls to the ground as glass beakers and bottles shatter around him. Sirius points a shaking finger at Harry. You will repeat what you saw to no one. Harry is already shaking his head, glancing at Caden, who is watching the whole thing. No, of course not. Sirius picks up a jar of some fluid and hurtles it across his office. It shatters into the wall. He grabs Harry by the robe and hauls him to his feet, shoving him against the wall. You had better not, Potter, or you will experience a pain so horrible you will wish you had never been born. He pushes Harry away from him. Now get out of my sight. Do not set foot in this office ever again. Harry turns and runs. Caden looks up at Sirius. You didn't stop him, Sirius said, looking at Caden, calming down. He is stubborn, Sirius. Caden answered. He will use a spell against me to look into the pensieve. He has done it before. He said, looking down at his left arm where the dark mark rested. It'll all be over soon. 47. The whole school is gathered in the Great Hall, looking at Professor McGonagall, who is standing in front of the staff table. Today begins your OWL exams. A number of ministry instructors are here to give them. Exams will take place for the next 2 weeks. Exams will be split in 2 parts, theory and practical application. Professor McGonagall said, I must warn you that the most stringent anti-cheating spells have been added to your exam papers. No student has successfully cheated on an OWL in a century, though every year someone tries it. She said, naturally, cheating will not be suffered, and anyone caught will be expelled from Hogwarts. Caden, Harry, and Ron stand on top of the astronomy tower, peering through the telescopes into the night sky. Caden's telescope is propped on the parapet, and he is leaning over it slightly. Below him, the doors to the great hall groan open. Golden light spills into the night, and 6 shadows move forward into the darkness. Caden, Harry, and Ron watch. Oi, that's Umbridge down there, Ron exclaimed, gaining the attention of every student. Several other students begin to watch the proceedings taking the place below. Harry looks panicked. They're heading for Hagrid's. The 3 of them exchange nervous glances. Eyes back on the sky, please, Professor Tofty said. The students ignore the professor. The 6 shadows approach the hut, silhouetted against the windows of it. They open the door, and it closes. 20 minutes left on your exam, students, Professor Tofty said. Shadows pace past the windows to Hagrid's hut. Raised voices reach them. Then a sharp bang is heard, along with a flash of blinding light from within the cabin. The door bursts open and Hagrid stumbles out, clutching at his waist, followed by the other 6. The 6 shadows fire stun spells at Hagrid. No, Harry exclaimed. The red-colored spells simply impact with Hagrid and bounce off of him. He stays quiet, waiting for the right time. Be reasonable, Hagrid. Hagrid yells incomprehensibly. Fong leaps from the open door onto Hallish, knocking the man over. Fong bounds over to Hagrid and leaps in front of him, taking a hex full in the chest and falls to the ground with a whine. Hagrid roars in rage, seizes the one responsible and hurls him 10 feet through the air. The man lands hard and does not move. Professor McGonagall storms through the doors of the Great Hall and out into the night, fury written across her face. Ron points to Professor McGonagall. Look, he said, making Harry smile. McGonagall, sort this out. Professor McGonagall marches towards them. Her face is illuminated every few moments by the red light of spells being fired. How dare you? How dare you? Professor McGonagall shouts in rage, breaking into a run. Stop this immediately, she exclaimed. Enough. She draws her wand in a swift motion. Instantly, 4 of the attackers turn to her and fire their spells. Before she can even react, they slam into her. She is briefly illuminated in blood-red light and then is lifted from her feet and hurled backward 5 feet to slam into the ground. She does not move. Cowards! Caden's voice suddenly rings through the Hogwarts grounds. He waves his wand, knocking the 5 of them off of their feet. Waving his wand again, and the 5 of them are dragged back towards Hagrid's cabin, knocking them out as their heads smashed against the wall. You are a coward, Umbridge, Caden said, hearing a growl coming from behind him making him smile. Hello, Harper, he said without turning around, knowing the Gryffindor is protective of everyone because of his wolf instinct. Caden looks at Hagrid, nodding to him to leave the grounds while Umbridge is distracted. Hagrid sent him a grateful look, hoists Fong onto his shoulders, and flees down towards the forest. Caden turns his attention back to Umbridge, who is looking after Hagrid's running figure. I'm sure you know about this wolf, Umbridge, he said, looking at the fuming look on her face as she looks at him. Students and teachers spill from the entry hall out into the night, running for Professor McGonagall. Caden looks away from Umbridge and moves to join the students, Harper trailing behind him. They surround her, several teachers leaning over her. She looks very pale and her eyes are closed. Others keep the students at a safe distance. Get her to the hospital wing right away, Professor Sprout said. Professor Flitwick steps forward and levitates Professor McGonagall into the air, floating her up the steps and into the school. They leave dozens of muttering students behind in the night. Some are also looking at Caden with amazement and awe, who turns around to look at the people he knocked out slowly coming into consciousness. The long tables in the Great Hall have been moved aside. In their place, hundreds of desks have been set up. It is at one of these that Caden now sits. Professor Marchbanks stands near the staff table. Before we begin, I have an update on Professor McGonagall. She will be all right and is resting in the hospital wing. Caden sighs with relief with the others who do the same, who look happy by that. You may now turn your papers over and begin, Professor Marchbanks said. Caden turns over his paper and stares at it for a second. Then he begins to mark on it. Harry stares at the last page of his exam. He winces and feels his scar, shakes his head, bends over his paper again. Again the scar twinges. Again he winces. The Great Hall fades away. Harry moves down towards the door at the end of the corridor. The same white light glows around its edges as in his dreams. He pauses before it, then tries the handle. It opens. The light overwhelms him. It dies abruptly. Harry stands in a huge room filled floor to ceiling with shelves. On each shelf there are many tint golden orbs. Lord Voldemort stands, grinning coldly at a man lying on the floor. Can you reach it? Can you take it for me, Black? Sirius, surrounded by Death Eaters, glares defiantly at Voldemort. I would rather die. Voldemort raises his wand. Sirius screams in agony, writhing on the floor of the dark chamber. Oh, you will die. Eventually. But there are hours, even days of pain awaiting you before then, Voldemort said, releasing Sirius, who slumps to the floor, panting for air. I'm going to enjoy this, Black. I have you, and soon I shall have the weapon. And then not even your pathetic order can stand in my way. Voldemort laughs, a horrible spine-chilling laugh. The room dissolves around Harry. Harry falls out of his seat, clutching at his scar in agony. Professor Marchbanks hurries to Harry's side. He pulls Harry to his feet and escorts him out of the Great Hall. Caden turns his head from where he is sitting, frowning after Harry's figure. 48. You all right? Ron asked, approaching Harry with Caden and Hermione behind him. Voldemort. He's got Sirius. In the Department of Mysteries. Harry exclaimed. Ron looks pale. How do you know? Hermione asked. I just saw it, Harry answered, looking out at the Hogwarts grounds, then turned back to them. How are we going to get there? To the Department of Mysteries? Ron asked, looking at Caden, who was looking down at the ground with a small frown, making him concerned, but it quickly goes away. We've got to do something, Harry exclaimed. Ron and Hermione exchange looks. How'd Voldemort get into the Ministry of Magic without being seen? I mean, he is the most wanted wizard in the world, Hermione said. Yeah, he can't just waltz into the Ministry of Magic, Ron said. It just seems so unlikely, Harry, Hermione said. Harry grabs her robes and glares at him. I won't let Sirius die. Just then, Ginny, Luna, Fred, George, Cedric and Victor round the corner. We heard Harry yelling. What's up? Ginny questioned. Voldemort's broken into the Department of Mysteries. He's got Sirius there, Harry said. He could already have the weapon. Think, Harry. Voldemort knows you. He knows you'd rush off to save Sirius, Caden said, speaking for the first time. There isn't anyone else, Caden, Harry exclaimed. Everyone from the Order is gone. Anything we can do to help? Ginny asked, glancing at Caden, who is slowly turning pale. No, there isn't, Harry exclaimed, instantly regretting it when hurt crosses Ginny's face. Yes, they can, Harry, Hermione said. How? Harry asked. Before we do anything, we need to establish that Sirius really isn't at headquarters, which means we'll need to break into Umbridge's office, Hermione said, smiling, and glanced at Fred and George. For that, we'll need a really good distraction. Fred and George grinned. Right you are, Hermione. Think we can whip something up, George? Fred asked, turning to George. Might be able to, George said, nodding. Just give us a few seconds, Fred said, turning to Hermione. Mind you, it's got to be really good, Hermione said. Not to worry, Hermione. We've got something that will outdo everything else we've done here combined, George said, grinning. It's been too quiet around here anyway, Fred said, grinning. Time we did some real damage to this place, George said. They leaned close to each other and began whispering together in excited voices. We'll also need to keep everyone away from her office, Hermione said. Ginny brightens. We can do that. Me and Luna'll guard the hallway. Harry smiles at them. We'll probably only manage 5 minutes or so, Hermione said. That's all we'll need, Harry said. Fred and George straightened. Right. You've got 10 minutes to get to Umbridge's office. And whatever you do, stay away from the astronomy tower for the next couple of hours, Fred said. Unless they spread, in which case, I'd get out of the castle for a while, George said, leaving with Fred. Hermione turns to Harry. Break out your invisibility cloak, Harry. Umbridge throws Harry to the floor. You think you could simply walk into my office without me knowing about it? Foolish boy. Harry looks around the room. Malfoy leans against a windowsill. Hermione, Caden, Ginny, Luna, Ron, and Neville, Cedric and Victor are under guard by the Inquisitional Squad, their wands piled on the floor. Umbridge draws her wand and waves it at Harry. Accio wand. Harry's wand flips from his pocket to Umbridge's hand. Who were you trying to contact? Umbridge asked. It's none of your business, Harry said. Draco, would you fetch Professor Snape, please? Umbridge said. Malfoy leaves and Umbridge smiles sickeningly at Harry. Very well, Potter. I have been patient enough with you. Malfoy returns with Professor Snape. You wish to see me? I have just caught Potter trying to communicate with someone in my fire. I need some Veritaserum, truth serum, Umbridge said. Well, it appears that I cannot help you. I have none, Severus said, glancing at Caden for a second before turning to leave. Harry looks at him desperately. He's got Padfoot at the place it's hidden. What? What does that mean? Umbridge questioned. Potter, if I want nonsense shouted at me, I shall inform you, Professor Snape said, sweeping out from the office. We've played nicely, Potter. You leave me no choice, Umbridge said, drawing her wand, moving menacingly at Harry. You could have saved me a lot of trouble if those Dementors I sent to your house had finished you off. You sent the Dementors? Caden and Harry asked. Of course I did. Someone had to act, Umbridge said, turning her wand to Caden. Crucio. Caden screams as the curse washes over him, stumbling down to the ground, shaking wildly. "No, please stop," Hermione begged, eyes wide with fear. Cedric and Victor have the same expression, though they couldn't do anything because of the rope around them. Umbridge looks pleased and turns to Hermione. Well. Hermione, no? Caden let out, breathing heavily. "We have to tell her, Harry," Hermione said, looking at Harry and glanced down at Caden. Harry looks down at Caden before looking up at Hermione, nodding. "We were trying to find Professor Dumbledore. We had to tell him." Hermione trailed off, looking down at Caden, who was looking up at the ceiling. "That it's ready. The weapon," she said, looking away from Caden. Umbridge's eyes are shining with eagerness, smiling at Hermione. "You and Mr. Potter will take me to it." Ron helps Caden up, letting the brunette lean against his body, while Cedric and Victor are glaring at Malfoy, who looks away from them. Time passes in the Umbridge's office. Caden can now stand on his own without Ron's help, and Malfoy is now pacing in front of them. "God, I can't wait until all you Weasleys have been expelled. Your stench has been fouling this castle for too long," Malfoy sneered. Ron glares at him. "Shut up, Malfoy." Malfoy smiles and punches Ron in the gut, knocking him to the ground. "That's for speaking to me. You know, you Weasleys are just as bad as mudbloods," Malfoy sneered. Caden looks down at Ron, who has fallen down near the pile of wands on the floor. Malfoy ignores Caden-turned head and sneers at Ginny. "You know, Weasley, it's really too bad Potter saved you from the Chamber of Secrets." Ginny struggles against Crabbe, who is restraining her. Ron snatches up his wand, pointing his wand at Crabbe. "Stupefy." Crabbe falls over. Ginny leaps at Malfoy, who is knocked to the ground. Luna kicks her restrainer in the shins. Caden turns to look at Marcus, who backs away from him with his hands raised up in surrender. Neville slips out of the strangled hold he'd been in and snatches up his wand. Goyle waves his wand, but Neville is faster. "Expelliarmus." The wand flies away as Ginny rolls away from Malfoy, scooping up her wand. She waves it at him, and he's blasted backward into the wall, slumping down to the floor. Caden helped Ron from the floor, a small frown on his face. "Are you all right?" he asked, holding onto Ron's arm, watching Luna untie Cedric and Victor from the rope, helping them stand up. "I am," Ron said, not looking at Neville and Marcus talking with each other. "We should go," Cedric said, clearing his throat to Neville and Marcus, who pulls away from their small, making out to look at them. "What are we supposed to do now?" They heard Harry ask Hermione. "That's just what we were wondering," Ron said, appearing around Hagrid's hut with Ginny, Caden, Luna, Neville, Marcus, Cedric, and Victor. Harry and Hermione look surprised. "So, how do we get to the Ministry?" Ron asked, tossing Harry and Hermione their wands. "I'd imagine we should fly," Hermione said. "We've got no brooms," Harry said. "There are other ways to fly," Luna said, nodding in the direction of the forest. "I mean, they can fly, and they're very good at finding places you need to go." Caden and Harry turn around and see 5 Thestrals watching them. "What are those?" Harry asked, looking at Caden for answers. "Thestrals," Caden answered, finally looking at Harry in the eyes. "Can only be seen by people who've witnessed death. I can see them too," Neville said, voice quiet. Harry claps his hands. "All right then, get on one, and we'll be off." The sun has set behind the mountains in the distance. Harry and Ginny, Caden and Hermione, Neville and Marcus, Ron and Luna, Cedric and Victor are each paired on one Thestral as they fly over the British landscape towards London. They soar between buildings and finally set down in front of a telephone booth. Ron jumps off of the Thestral shakily. "Never again," he said, voice shaking slightly. "You can ride a broom, but you can't ride a Thestral?" Caden questioned, helping Hermione off from the Thestral. "That's..." Ron didn't know how to respond to that. "You should just give up, Ron," Hermione said, fixing her hair. "What now, Harry?" Ginny asked. Harry leads the way to the telephone booth. He opens the door and steps in. The rest cram inside with him. The lift grinds to a halt and the doors swing open. Harry and the others step out to the receptionist area with the golden fountain. The place is deathly quiet and completely deserted. They fan out, wands at the ready. Harry waits a moment. All right, come on, Harry said, heading past the fountain and up the steps into the Ministry of Magic. This larger lift clinks downward slowly. Finally, it grinds to a halt. Department of Mysteries. The doors open and Harry leads the others out. This department is also abandoned. Where is everyone? Harry asked. The ministry closed a half-hour ago. I expect they all went home, Ginny said. Harry nods grimly. That's how Voldemort got in unnoticed. They walk until they reach the hallway from Harry's dreams. This is it. Come on, Harry said. They make their way down the long hall until they reach the door at the end of the hall. Harry tries the handle and it opens. Stay close, Caden said to everyone, standing beside Harry. 49. This room is large and circular, filled with identical doors all the way around. It is illuminated by blue-flamed candles. After Neville enters the room, the door swings shut with an echoing bang. Now where? Ginny said, looking at Caden and Harry. Harry looks around, confused. I don't understand. In our dream, the doors weren't identical. Well, let's try a few, Hermione suggested. Harry nods, agreeing with her. Yeah, we'll know the way when we see it, he said, going to the first door he sees and opens the door. He steps inside, with the others trailing behind him. This room is like an upside-down ziggurat, with huge steps leading to the base of the pit. On the lowest level rests a dark, gray veil that flutters as if there were a breeze. Soft whispers fill the room. Who's there? Harry called out, clambering down to the veil and stares hard at it. The whispers intensify as Harry looks around the room. Sirius? There's no one here, Harry. This isn't the right room, Hermione said. Does anyone hear that? Harry asked. I do. It's coming from the veil, Luna said. They look at the veil which flutters menacingly though there is no wind. Harry slowly moves closer to it. Harry, Caden said, moving closer to Harry. Harry didn't stop from walking, eyes locked on the veil. There are people in there, Luna exclaimed. What do you mean, people? Ron questioned. Harry, we should leave, Caden said, stopping Harry from reaching out towards the veil. Harry tries to pull away from him, but couldn't. Harry, we're here for Sirius, remember? He said, and that seems to stop Harry from his trance. Sirius, yeah, Harry said, dropping his hand away from the veil. Caden leads him away from the veil, arm wrapped around his shoulders as they all return to the room of doors. Hermione draws a flaming X over the door they just closed. Harry moves to the next one, finding it locked. He raises his wand over the door. Alohomora. He tries, but it remains closed. Whatever's in there, the ministry sure doesn't want anyone getting to it, he said, moving to the next door and opens it, stepping inside. They enter the clock room, where every surface is covered in clocks. This is it. Come on, Harry said as they move through the clocks. He leads them back to the end of the room, where another door lies. This is it. This is where Sirius is, he said, opening the door and charging through. Harry and the others spill into the hall of prophecy and stop. Harry glances around as they all grip their wands tightly in their hand. The room is gigantic, being over 50 feet high and incredibly long. There are rows and rows of shelves, and on every shelf are dozens of dusty golden orbs. The room is lit by more blue-flamed candles. He's in here somewhere, Harry said, leading them down the center aisle, peering down each row. He turns down one row, leading them to the end. This end opens out into another wide aisle, finding the row empty. Harry looks around in confusion. I don't think Sirius is here, Hermione said, noticing that Ron is staring at one of the orbs. Caden, Harry, have you seen this? Ron was the one to speak, turning to look at Caden and Harry. It's got your names on it. Sure enough, there was a golden orb resting on the shelf with the label SBT to APWBD, the Dark Lord and Caden Potter and Harry Potter. Harry reaches out for it. What's our name doing here? Don't touch it, Harry, Hermione exclaimed. Harry glares at her. Why not? Yeah, Harry, don't, Neville said, suddenly looking very pale. It's got our name on it, Harry said, taking the orb off the shelf and looks at it. I warned you before that one day you would come to a sticky end, Potter, Lucius said, emerging from the shadows, cloaked all in black. 24 other Death Eaters emerge around him. Harry and the others are surrounded and outnumbered. Where's Sirius? Harry asked. Lucius and several other Death Eaters laugh. We don't have him, if that's what you mean, Lucius said, glancing at Caden, who moves to stand beside Harry. You never did you? It was all just a trick, Caden said, noticing the proud look on Lucius' face. Such a smart boy, Lucius said, glancing back at Harry. The Dark Lord knows your weakness for heroics, Potter. All it took was a little nudge to get you there, he said, reaching out his hand, palm up. Now give me that prophesy. What prophesy? Harry questioned. Lucius points at the golden orb in Harry's hand. That prophesy. Now hand it over, or we'll have to use wands on you. Harry raises his wand at the same time as Ginny, Caden, Neville, Marcus, Hermione, Ron, Luna, Cedric and Victor raise theirs. Go ahead, Harry said, looking straight at Lucius' eyes. Lucius regards him coldly. Very brave of you, Potter. Or are you foolish? Come and find out, Harry said, but Lucius doesn't move. Really, Potter? You expect to defeat all of us with your little school friends? Now hand it over, and they won't have to die here, Lucius said. One of the Death Eaters moves forward, throwing back her hood, revealing Bellatrix Lestrange. I haven't escaped from Azkaban for this, Lestrange exclaimed, raising her wand, but Lucius forced her arm down. No. If the prophesy is smashed, Lucius stops himself, glancing at Caden before turning to Harry. But Lestrange turns to several other Death Eaters. Take the youngest girl. We'll see how committed Potter is as we torture her, Lestrange said. Caden, Ron, Hermione, Luna, Neville, Marcus, Cedric and Victor close and around Ginny. Harry steps in front of Ginny, wand out and aimed at Lestrange's chest. He holds the prophesy in his other wand. You even try to take her and I'll smash this thing, Harry said, tossing the prophesy casually into the air and catches it again. Lucius starts in horror. So, what kind of prophesy are we talking about here? Harry asked. Surely you jest, Potter? Lestrange said. Not really. How come Voldemort wants it? Harry asked. You dare to speak the Dark Lord's name? Lucius asked, arching an eyebrow. Who? Voldemort? Oh yeah, I dare. Voldemort, Voldemort, Voldemort. Harry was cut off by Lestrange. Silence. How dare you utter that name from your half-blood mouth? Lestrange exclaimed. Hey, did you know Voldemort's a half-blood too? Harry asked. Lestrange raises her wand to strike, but Lucius stops her again. Control yourself, Bellatrix, Lucius hissed. What's so special about this prophesy anyway? Harry questioned. Lestrange shrieks with laughter. You mean Dumbledore never told you both the reason you bear that scar was hidden here? Lucius asked. Harry looks as if he was slapped, surprise shown on his face. What? Lucius and the Death Eaters laugh again. Caden turns his head slightly, noticeable to his friends, but unnoticeable to the Death Eaters. When I give the signal, blast the shelves, he whispers from under his breath. Harry, Ron and Hermione nod grimly. So that's what took you so long. We wondered, Lucius said. But why did he need us to take it? Harry asked. Only a person for whom the prophesy was made can remove it from itself, Potter, and the Dark Lord couldn't get it himself. Lucius said. So he used me to do his dirty work, did he? Harry asked. Precisely, Potter, Lucius said. Now, Caden exclaimed, and no less than 10 wands fired into the shelves at once. The Death Eaters cover their faces as debris covers them. Run, Harry exclaimed. Dust fills the air as the entire shelves fall crashing to the ground, raining glass shards and golden orbs. 50. The students break and run for the door, but Lucius grabs Harry by the shoulder and Caden waves his wand at him. Stupefy, Caden exclaimed, and Lucius is blasted backwards as he and Harry run after the others. Spells explode around them as they keep running for the door. Stop them, Lucius exclaimed. Victor slams the door shut after all of them come through the door, pointing his wand at it. Colloportus, Victor said, sealing the door. Harry looks around. Only Caden, Hermione, Neville, Marcus, Cedric and Victor were the ones still with them. Where'd the rest go? Caden and Hermione look around. Harry, they went the wrong way, Hermione exclaimed as they instantly ran after Ron, Ginny, and Luna. Just then, the door blasts off its hinges. Caden, Harry, Hermione, Neville, Marcus, Cedric and Victor dive underneath several desks. Death Eaters enter the room, slowly moving between the clocks and desks. They must have gone on to the hall. A Death Eater said, "Check under the desks." Lestrange said to the Death Eater, who nodded, but he didn't get as far as Harry leaps out from under his desk. "Stupefy," Harry said as a jet of red light hits the Death Eater in the chest, knocking him backward into the wall. Hermione jumps from under her desk and runs for the exit. Lestrange sees her and raises her wand. "Avada Serpensortia," Caden said, and a snake burst through his wand, going for Lestrange, who was distracted enough for Harry to finish her off. "Stupefy," Harry said, and Lestrange is struck with the same red light and falls to the ground. There was suddenly a yell from the next room. "Ron!" Harry exclaimed as two Death Eaters entered the room. "Impedimenta," the Death Eater said. The spell blasts Harry, Hermione, Neville, and Marcus backward. Neville flies over a desk. Hermione and Marcus strike a bookshelf and are nearly buried under the falling books, and Harry strikes the wall. "We've go, Defendo," Cedric said, cutting the Death Eater into two pieces, quickly dodging away the spell coming his way. "Sustenendum," Victor said, as the second Death Eater falls to the ground and cannot move. Caden quickly ran to the books, helping Marcus and Hermione out from under the books while Harry and Neville moved towards them. "Come on, we need to go," Caden said, checking Marcus and Hermione for injuries. "We're fine, let's go," Marcus said, pushing Caden forward. Caden, Harry, Hermione, Neville, Marcus, Cedric and Victor re-emerged into the circular room of doors. Hermione's X's have fades from the walls. "Where do we go?" Neville asked. "I don't know," Harry answered. A door opens and Luna and Ginny emerge, helping Ron walk between them. "What happened?" Harry questioned, watching as Victor takes Ron's weight off of Luna and Ginny. "I think my ankle's broken, and somebody hit Ron with a weird spell," Ginny said. Ron laughs strangely, gaining a curious look from Caden and Harry. "Hiya, Caden and Harry," he said, giggling. "You two look funny," he said, laughing again. Ginny's legs give way, and Harry catches her before she could fall to the ground. "They hit her with something too," Luna said. "We need to get out of here." "Luna, can you help Ginny?" Harry asked, and Luna nodded, moving to Ginny's side. Another door opens, and 5 Death Eaters emerge. "There they are," Lestrange exclaimed. Stunning spells rain all around them, and the sounded group heads for the nearest door. Luna is blasted off her feet by a stunning spell. She and Ginny tumble to the floor, and Caden and Harry has no choice but to keep running. The next stunning spell hits Hermione, Neville, Marcus, and Cedric in the back, falling to the ground. Caden, Harry, Ron, and Victor stagger into the room of the veil. Just as they enter, Ron is hit and falls. Harry slips and tumbles down to the bottom of the chamber, stopping by the dais of the veil. Caden quickly ran towards Harry, helping him up as the doors all around them burst open and Death Eaters entered, climbing down to surround them from a safe distance. Caden looks at Harry, noticing that blood trickles out of his mouth, and turns back to Lucius, who shoves his way towards them. "Your race is run, Potters. Hand it over," Lucius said. Caden, Harry, and Victor glance around, wands poised at them. "Let our friends go and I will go with you," Caden said, turning his head to look at Lucius, who froze. "Don't do it, Caden. Don't," Neville exclaimed, struggling against the Death Eater holding him. "Stop, Neville," Caden exclaimed. Lestrange looks at Neville. "Neville? Neville Longbottom?" she asked, laughing in glee. "My dear boy, I paid your parents a visit a long time ago. We had such a time." "You put them in St. Mungo's," Neville exclaimed. Lestrange beams at him. "So, Potters," Give us the prophesy, or I'll see how long it takes to crack Longbottom like his parents. Don't give it to them, Neville exclaimed. Lestrange points her wand at him, but Caden moves in his way before she could hit him. Crucio. Caden goes down to his knees, lips tightening shut as pain fills his entire body. The doors at the top of the chamber explode off their hinges. Everything stops as Remus, Sirius, Delphine, Moody, Tonks, and Kingsley enter the room. They blast spells at the Death Eaters. Lucius moves to attack, but Tonks disarms him. Harry moves to the kneeling Caden, kneeling down next to him. "Are you all right?" he asked, which is a dumb question to ask. "Yeah," Caden said, cracking his neck, and sighed when he heard a satisfying crack. He and Harry begin making their way away from the fighting when a man grabs Harry from behind, his large, sweaty arm around Harry's throat. "Give me the prophesy." Caden leaps upon his back and hits him in the face. Harry elbows him in the ribs, and as the man falls away, he strikes Harry's hand by accident, sending the prophesy flying. Lucius sees it, raising his wand. Sirius leaps into him, and both men fall the rest of the way to the lowest level of the room, landing hard. The prophesy bounces off of a step, flips down to the next level, and shatters against the stone. A ghostly version of Professor Trelawney appears over the shattered golden orb, speaks something which cannot be heard over the fight, and dissolves away. Caden and Harry seem frozen, staring at the broken pieces of the orb. Neville joined them beside Caden. Sirius gets to his feet and sprints to the three. "Get out of here, you three," he said, pointing at one of the doors. "That will take you back out of the Department of Mysteries," he said, starting to go back to the fight, but Harry grabs his hand. "You come with us," Harry exclaimed. Sirius shakes his head. "You both are the important one now, Harry. I have to help the Order." Slowly, Harry lets go of Sirius' robe sleeve, looking into his godfather's eyes. "I'll always be here for you, Harry. Now go," Sirius exclaimed, pushing Harry away from him towards the door as a spell rocketed past Sirius's head. Lestrange leaps down in front of Sirius. She smiles and Sirius grins. "Hello, cousin," Sirius said, firing a spell at her. Harry and Neville climb towards the door. Not noticing that Caden is staying still, Sirius not noticing either. "Potter," Lucius exclaimed as the two whirled around to look at him, holding his wand out at them. "We may lose the prophecy, but I can still deliver you and Caden to the Dark Lord," he said, waving his wand. "Stupefy. Protego," Victor said, moving in front of Harry and Neville as Lucius' spell bounces away from them. The door opens and Professor Dumbledore, eyes blazing, enters, his wand at the ready. "It's Dumbledore," Neville exclaimed. Lucius attempts to run, but Professor Dumbledore snaps his wand out, and Lucius is knocked over and dragged back. Professor Dumbledore moves past Harry, Neville, and Victor, descending into what appears to be a war zone. He reaches the fight before the Death Eaters even know he's there. Professor Dumbledore blasts two of them across the room before the rest notices. They break for the exits, but members of the Order are already there, stunning them. Lestrange fires a stunning spell, and Sirius ducks under it, laughing. "Is that the best you've got, cousin?" Sirius said, and he doesn't even see it coming. He barely finished his sentence when he was pushed to the side by Caden. The spell struck Caden in the chest instead of Sirius, as he was lifted up into the air. And then Caden falls into the veil, his body simply falling behind it. He does not reappear on the other side. The last thing Caden hears was Harry agony scream. 51, 6th year. Caden opens his eyes, confusion filling his face as he looks around at the people walking around what seems to be a town. There are houses, a fountain, a park, cars, roads, and sidewalks on either side of the road. He looked down at himself, seeing that he was wearing his Hogwarts clothes without the robe. The Hufflepuff tie around his neck is a bright yellow to the white town. He looks up and starts walking on the sidewalk, looking around at the unfamiliar faces around him. He wonders where he is. Not where he is. He knows he's dead by saving Sirius from death itself. He stopped when he saw a house with the name Potter on the mailbox, looking at it with confusion. He looks around. The people are walking around him, not minding that he has stopped so suddenly. He decided to start walking towards the house, stopping in front of the door and looks up at the house from his perspective. He looks at the door, where two golden baby head carving is rested in the middle of the door. One is wearing glasses and the other is not. The door is suddenly opened and a familiar woman with bright red hair and glinting green eyes looks at him with a shocked expression. "Caden?" she said, taking her hand off of the door to stand in front of her son. "Mom." Caden lets out, looking at his mother, who is suddenly looking at him with saddened eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, what did you do?" Lily said, wrapping her arms around Caden, bringing him close to her body as she took this in. "Her son is dead. Her 16-year-old son is dead." "I had to," Caden said, pulling away to look up at her. "I couldn't let Sirius die." Lily looks down at her son with sympathy, brushing her finger down her son's temple, looking into the blue eyes that she had only seen years ago. "My little hero," she said softly, smiling, pecking his forehead. She wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders and lead him inside the house, showing the interior that is inside the home. "What is this place?" Caden asked, looking up at her, who softly smiled down at him. "Home," Lily answered, turning her head to the bedroom door when it opened and her husband came out, smiling at her when he saw her, but his smile fades when he sees who is with her. "Caden?" James said, looking at Caden with the same expression she had when she saw him. He looks at Lily, noticing the sad smile on her face as she looks down at Caden. Caden waves at his father nervously, not knowing what to say from meeting his father. Should he be shocked, sad, happy, all of them at the same time? James moves forward and wraps his arms around his son, tightly hugging him. He let Caden pulls away first, looking down at him, who is looking at him with calculating eyes. "What is this place?" Caden asked, looking at his parents. "Afterlife," James answered, leading Caden to the couch and sat him down. He sat down beside Caden, his wife sitting on the other side of Caden. "It's where you go when you die," he said, turning his body to look at his son. "Time moves differently here," Lily said, leaning back on the couch. "It does?" Caden asked. Lily nods, smiling softly. She leaned forward, placing her hand on top of Caden's hand. "You should go back, dear," she said, looking at the confused expression on Caden's face. "You still have so much to live for." "I can go back?" Caden questioned. "Of course," James said, smiling. "But what about this?" Caden said, pulling up his left sleeve up, showing the dark mark to his parents. "He will be able to know where I am," he said, looking up at his parents. Lily smiles and places her palm on top of the dark mark. Caden watches as a bright white light shines from under her palm, and when she picks her palm up, the dark mark is no longer there. There's not even a scar to show that it has been there in the first place. "Where do I need to go?" Caden asked, looking up from his arm. "And where will I wake up?" "The last place you took your last breath at," James said, standing up, taking Caden and his wife with him as they began walking out of the Potter's home. They walked for a while, Caden telling them everything they had missed while in the afterlife. Caden stopped talking when he saw the door in front of him, except this time it is brown rather than white like all of the other houses. Caden starts walking towards the door but stops, turning around to look at his parents, who smile at him. "Farewell, son," James said, nodding. "Be safe, we love you," Lily said, smiling softly. "And tell Harry we love him, will you?" Caden nods, turning around and starts walking towards the door. He wrapped his hand around the knob and turned it. The door opened and Caden walked forward, closing his eyes when a bright light landed into his eyes. And when he opened his eyes, he looked around at the place where he was last seen. He starts walking towards the door without hesitation and quietly opens it, peeking his head out in the empty room, and starts walking out of the ministry. He apparate himself to Severus' house, not the one he had grown in. It's the one Severus told him to stay at to keep out of Voldemort. Talking about Voldemort, he looks down at his left sleeve, pulling up the sleeve, and a small smile appears on his lips when he sees nothing there. He enters the house, looking around at the dusty house even though he had only been gone for a short time. He starts making his way towards the bedroom, not stopping as he continues walking into the bathroom and shower. He walks out after 45 minutes pass, a towel wrapped around his waist as he walks towards the closet, taking the pajamas out of the closet and starts slipping it on. He walks towards the bed, laying down on his back as he looks up at the ceiling, sighing. He will go back to Hogwarts tomorrow. Right now he is too tired to travel. But before he sleeps, he should warn Professor Dumbledore that he is alive, so the students won't be surprised by his appearance. The next morning when he is getting ready for Hogwarts, an owl knocks on the window, and when Caden opens the window and takes the letter from the owl, Professor Dumbledore had told the students about his presence today, and some of them are excited to see him again, making him smile at that. 52. Caden gets out of the train, walking towards the carriage where he can see Mr. Filch waiting for him with a nasty look. He approaches the caretaker and lets the man check his trunks in case of any danger. He knows he doesn't, but it's better to check than not. Mr. Filch finishes checking his trunks and starts walking towards the carriage with Caden behind him. They ride in silence towards the castle. Caden is looking around the place, awkward. When they arrive, Caden lets Mr. Filch get off first before he himself gets off of the carriage. Caden starts walking towards the Hogwarts castle, towards the Great Hall where Professor Dumbledore told him everyone is waiting for him. Though, Professor Dumbledore did warn that some Slytherin are not happy with him at the moment. Why? He doesn't have the answer for that. He stops at the entrance doors of the Great Hall, watching every student turn their head to look at him when they hear an approaching footsteps. Caden starts walking into the Great Hall, letting a small smile take over his face when he sees Harry looking at him with a bright smile at seeing him again. He can tell Harry is holding himself back from jumping out of his seat to hug him. He walks towards the Hufflepuff table, sitting next to Susan, who wraps her arms around his shoulders, welcoming him back to Hogwarts. Professor Dumbledore makes a small speech of Caden returning to life again was a wonderful thing and welcomes him back to Hogwarts, and because Caden wasn't there when they first began, introduces the new potions professor, Horace Slughorn. Caden wasn't surprised to hear Sirius getting the defense against the dark arts position. Though, he did worry about Sirius. Some of the dark arts teachers they had have done bad stuff to Harry before. But he quickly put those thoughts away, glancing away from Professor Dumbledore to Malfoy, who seemed to be staring at him. Caden looked away, looking at Professor Dumbledore, who told them to enjoy their lunch, and sat down. He starts eating, listening to Justin and Susan catch him up on what has been happening. Susan was nice enough to write to Cedric and Victor, telling them about him being alive again. Susan promised to give him the letter Cedric and Victor wrote specifically for him. Caden should get her a gift for the kindness she is giving him. He told her he appreciates what she is doing, making Susan smile brighter than before, patting his shoulder, and starts eating her lunch. It's the next day, and Harry dragged Caden away from the library to the corridor where he stood with Harry and Ron, looking at the crowd of students that were trying to get to their classes. But they were quickly caught by Professor McGonagall, who told them to go to the potions class. Ron tries to beg Harry not to go, but he relented when he looked at Caden, who was just waiting for them to do anything. Professor McGonagall wanted Caden to not go to classes today, wanting him to rest just in case coming back from the afterlife has some side effects. But Caden shook his head and told her he was fine, following after Harry and Ron, who were waiting for him at the turn of a corridor. They start walking towards the potions classroom, Harry and Ron talking with each other about some random stuff while Caden listens to them talk with a small smile. They arrive at the potions class with Harry dragging Ron inside the classroom. The other students turn in unison. Caden, Harry, I was beginning to worry. And I see we've brought someone with us, Professor Slughorn said, greeting Caden and Harry before looking at Ron. Ron Weasley, sir. But I'm dead awful at potions, a menace actually, so I probably should just be going. Ron's words were cut off by Professor Slughorn. Nonsense, we'll sort you out. Any friend of Caden and Harry's is a friend of mine. Right then, books out. Professor Slughorn words was cut off by Harry, who now looks awkward. Sorry, sir, but I haven't got my book yet, nors Caden or Ron. You see, not to worry. You can get what you need from the cupboard, Professor Slughorn said, waving to the cupboard. Caden walks forward, noticing the confused expression on Harry and Ron's face. He stops to answer them. I have a good memory. I memorized everything in the book. He explained to them, who nodded, walking towards the cupboard. Caden makes his way towards Hermione and stands next to her, who smiles at him in greeting, which he returns. Now, as I was saying, I've prepared a few concoctions this morning. Any ideas what these might be? Professor Slughorn asked, and both Caden and Hermione raised their hands, but Caden was slightly faster than hers. Yes, Mr. Potter? That one is Veritaserum, Caden answered. And that would be Polyjuice potion. And that? He trailed off, distracted by Harry and Ron fighting for the books. He looks back at Professor Slughorn, who is looking at him patiently. Is Amortentia the most powerful love potion in the world? He said, looking at Hermione, and told her to take it away. He guessed he does have some side effects as he clears his throat from the soreness. It's rumored to smell differently to each person, according to what attracts them. Hermione said without hesitation. For example, I smell freshly mown grass and new parchment and spearmint. Toothpaste. She stops herself from talking, blushing. Professor Slughorn regards her. One of my best friends is Muggleborn. She's the best in our year. Harry, settling into his seat with the soiled textbook, looks up just as Professor Slughorn's eyes shift to Caden and him for confirmation. Caden and Harry nod as Hermione glances curiously at them. Now Amortentia doesn't create actual love, of course. That's impossible. But it does cause a powerful infatuation or obsession. For that reason, it is probably the most dangerous potion in this room, Professor Slughorn said, turning to find a sea of dreamy faces leaning into the vapors. Instantly, he clangs a cover onto the cauldron, bringing them round. Sir, you haven't told us what's in that one, Katie said, pointing to a small black cauldron. Professor Slughorn steps to a small black cauldron, begins to ladle a bit of golden liquid into a tiny vial. What you see before you, ladies and gentlemen, is a curious little potion known as Felix Felicis, but it is more commonly referred to as liquid luck, Hermione said. A buzz runs through the class. Even Malfoy perks up. Yes, Miss Granger. Desperately tricky to make. Disastrous should you get it wrong. But brewed correctly, as this has been, it has remarkable powers. One sip, and you will find that all your endeavors succeed. At least until the effects wear off, Professor Slughorn said. But then why don't people drink it all the time? Katie asked. Because taken in excess it causes giddiness, recklessness, and dangerous overconfidence. Professor Slughorn answered. Have you ever taken it, sir? Blaise asked. Twice. Once when I was 24. Once when I saw 57. 2 tablespoons taken at breakfast. 2 perfect days. Professor Slughorn eyes the vial dreamily, adrift. Finally, he blinks. So, this is what I offer each of you today. 2 tiny vial of liquid luck. To the student who, in the hour that remains, manages to brew an acceptable draft of living death, the recipe for which can be found on page 10 of your textbook. Professor Slughorn said. Excitement seizes the class, and Professor Slughorn smiles knowingly. You should know that in all the years of my previous tenure at Hogwarts, not once did a student brew a potion of sufficient quality to claim this prize. In any event, good luck. He sets the vial upon his desk, where it shimmers in a shaft of sunlight. Caden begins making draft of living death, taking the silver dagger upon his desk and placing the flat of the blade against the bean and presses. Instantly, the protective parchment covering the desk runs red with juice. How did you do that? Hermione questioned, looking at Caden and Harry. Crush the bean, not cut it. Caden answered, looking up from the bean on his desk to Hermione. Those instructions are unclear, he whispered, pointing the dagger to the book. Hermione slowly nods, looking at the book with hesitation now. Caden lifts the parchment and tips the juice into his cauldron. It hisses, then turns lilac. He does the next thing he needs, then adds one last ingredient to the draft and steps back, done with the potion. Soon after, Professor Slughorn wins his way amongst the cauldrons, nodding with sympathy at the fiascos before him. Then he stops, staring in disbelief at the pearly sheen of 2 bubbling potions. Merlin's beard. But it's perfect. So perfect I dare say 1 sip would kill us all. Your mother was a dab hand at potions, but this? My, what can't you both do, boy? Perhaps you both will save us all in the end. Professor Slughorn said, looking at Caden and Harry. All eyes turned to Caden and Harry, making Harry's smile falters. Here you are then, as promised. 2 bottles of Felix Felicis. Use it well, Professor Slughorn said, watching Caden and Harry take it from his hands. 53. Caden sits himself next to Hermione on the Quidditch stands, looking out onto the pitch where he can see the Gryffindor Quidditch team trying out for their position. I heard Cormac tried to flirt with you, Hermione said, turning her head to look at Caden, who leaned back on his seat. He did, but I already told him I'm taken by 2 wonderful men, Caden answered, turning his head away from the pitch to Hermione. What about you? He asked, cocking his head. What about me? Hermione asked, confused. Did he try to flirt with you too? Caden asked. Hermione nods, sighing. Unfortunately. Caden pats Hermione's back sympathetically, looking back onto the pitch where he can see Ron glancing up at Hermione. Hermione sees this and smiles at him, waving while she's at it. When are you 2 going to get together? Caden asked, amusement filling him when Hermione turned to look at him with a flustered expression. I don't know what you're talking about, Hermione quickly said, looking back onto the pitch, ignoring Caden's eyes. Caden snorts and looks back onto the pitch, watching the Gryffindors get onto their brooms and starts playing. He saw Ginny flying swiftly, handling the quaffle with ease, and 2 second years collide in midair, making him wince. Ron and Cormac both make a save, though Ron's looks shakier than Cormac. Hermione seems to be a nervous wreck beside him, so he wraps his arm around her shoulders and starts stroking his thumb on her shoulder, trying to calm her down, and she sends him a grateful smile. Katie snatches a quaffle with one hand and splits 2 defenders beautifully and makes a slick blind pass to Dean, who jets high in the air, then lets the quaffle roll off his fingers right into Ginny's hands as she races below. Seamus sends a bludger rocketing into the stands, scattering a group of onlookers, leaving only Neville, who sidles delicately to the right as the others leg it. 2 third years collide in midair, making Caden winces again. Cormac makes another save. Ron turns the wrong way but somehow makes the save anyway as the quaffle hits off the tail of his broom. Demelza Robbins, bent low over her stick, pins the quaffle under her chin and splits 2 bludgers and a pair of beaters. 2 fourth years collide in midair, but this time Caden didn't wince, already knowing it will happen. 2 aspiring beaters whiff on a pair of bludgers and whack each other instead and plummet to the pitch as the bludgers ricochet off one another and go flying into the stands, scattering onlookers yet again and leaving, as before, only Neville. This time, he sidles delicately to the left. Cormac makes a save, and the quaffle bounces off Ron's head. 2 fifth years collide in midair. Caden leans forward to look down at the pitch where he can see the survivors pressing ice packs to their heads, running tape around their twisted fingers. He then looks at Harry, who is talking with both Ron and Cormac. Then Demelza and Ginny rocket forth. Ron weaves nervously while Cormac hovers in place, a confident sneer on his face. Come on, Ron, Hermione mutters under her breath. Demelza hunkers over her broom once again, flying like an arrow. Then she goes into a wide, sweeping slide. Ginny blasts over the pitch, her hair streaming like flames, then rolls recklessly to the side. As one, they both let fly. Hermione, face buried in her fingers, mutters something. Cormac, at the last moment, inexplicably rolls his broom to the right and the quaffle sails over his shoulder. Ron, zigzagging crazily, nearly falls off, right himself in a panic, and deflects Ginny's quaffle with his forehead. As a few partisan cheers erupt from the stands, Harry grins, then has to restrain himself. From beside Caden, Hermione slowly opens her eyes. Isn't he brilliant? Lavender said dreamily. Hermione stares balefully at Lavender, then notices Cormac eyeing his broom incredulously. She gets up, taking Caden's hand, and slips away with Caden behind her. For weeks you carry around this book, practically sleep with it, Hermione began. And you have no desire to find out who the Half-Blood Prince is? I didn't say I wasn't curious. And by the way, I don't sleep with it, Harry said, defending himself. Ron lets out a sarcastic chortle. Yeah, right, he said as Harry glares at him. Well, it's true. I like a nice chat before I go to bed. Now you're always reading that bloody book. It's like being with Hermione. This time it's Hermione's turn to glare, lips quirking up when Caden smacks the back of Ron's head. You know, the last time we had a book, Ginny almost died. Caden said. Hermione agreed with him. It's not taking control of my mind yet, Harry said, looking at Caden. Isn't that what happened with the diary? Caden questioned, looking at Ron and Hermione, who nodded. Well, I was curious. So I went to. Hermione's words were cut off by Harry and Ron. The library, Harry and Ron said. And? Caden asked, ignoring Harry and Ron, as he looked at Hermione. And nothing. There's no reference to the Half-Blood Prince anywhere, Hermione said. Good. That settles it then, Harry said, not noticing Caden rolling his eyes at that. Hermione starts to object when Hagrid's voice breaks through them. Hey, you four, Hagrid exclaimed, emerging out of the trees, beard crusted in white, looking like a crazed Father Christmas. Behind him, deep in the woods, Aurors can be seen. Caden and Hermione eyes them briefly, then she nods to the pulsating burlap bag Hagrid clutches in his fist. What VE you got there, Hagrid? Hermione asked. Hagrid tips open the bag, making Harry, Ron, and Hermione grimace while Caden didn't have any reaction. Stink sap. Burn the whiskers right off your chin. Trees air are drippin' with it. Stink sap? You're not sick, are you? Caden asked, looking up at Hagrid with concern. It's not fair me. It's fair Aragog. Ya remember Aragog, don't ya? Hagrid asked. I've heard about it, Caden said, shrugging. Spider? About 6 feet tall, 10 feet wide. Ron listed. That's the one. He's taken ill. I'm hoping to nurse him back. Keep your fingers crossed, Hagrid said, crossing his fingers. Hope he gets better soon. Caden said. Hagrid sent him a grateful smile and disappeared back into the trees. Barking. Does he not remember that raving arachnid tried to eat us? What? Ron questioned, looking at Hermione, who is staring at the Aurors. The Aurors? I know they're here to protect us, but somehow I don't feel any safer, Hermione said. Caden wraps his arm around Hermione's shoulders. Me too, he said, turning his head to look at Harry, turning his head where Harry is looking at and furrowing his eyebrows when he sees Professor Slughorn entering the 3-broomstick. Why is Harry staring at Professor Slughorn? 54. Caden, Harry, Ron, and Hermione enter the 3-broomstick, Harry glancing around and locates Slughorn at the bar, planted plumply on a stool. No, over here, Harry said, leading them to a dirty table and sitting down before the 3 of them could complain. The 3 of them exchange a glance, shrug, and join Harry on the dirty table. Ron starts to take the chair directly opposite Harry, blocking his view of Slughorn. Caden takes notice of Harry, trying to look at Professor Slughorn, and moves Ron's chair closer to him as he sits down on the opposite side of Hermione. He takes notice of Harry looking relieved by that, sharing a look with Hermione, who is also looking at Harry weirdly. A skinny kid in an apron appears, tossing a filthy rag upon the table, which begins to wipe the surface on its own. Harry cranes his neck around the kid to keep Slughorn in his view. What'll we have? The kid asked, looking at the 4. For butterbeers. Splash of ginger in? Hermione looks at Caden, wondering if he wants it in his butterbeer too, and he nods. His and mine, please. The kid whistles and the rag leaps back into his pocket. Harry continues to eye Slughorn when he sees Malfoy. They lock eyes briefly, then Malfoy exits. Ah, bloody hell, Ron said, glowering at his little sister, who sits in a dark corner with Dean, their faces lit by a guttering candle. Oh, honestly, Ronald, they're just holding hands. Hermione trailed off, seeing Dean kissing Ginny. And snogging. I'd like to leave, Ron said, glowering, rubbing at the back of his head when Caden smacked his head. Leave? You can't be serious, Hermione said, raising an eyebrow. That happens to be my sister, Ron said, and Harry perked up at that. Caden's my brother, and I don't leave when they start making out last year, Harry said. Caden raised an eyebrow at that. Yeah, congrats on cock blocking us every time, Harry, Caden said, shaking his head, making Hermione smile at that. I was cock blocking? Harry asked, completely clueless that he had done that last year. Caden sighs heavily, slouching back on the chair. "Caden, Harry, boy." Professor Slughorn's voice booms so loudly even Ginny jumps and catches Harry looking. As he waddles over, sloshing the mug in hand, Harry rises immediately, an action so grossly out of character that Hermione regards him with amused curiosity while Caden looks at him weirdly. "Hello, sir. Wonderful to see you," Harry said, greeting the man. Hermione, brow wrinkling, turns to Caden and Ron, silently mouthing what Harry had said to Professor Slughorn. "So what brings you here, sir?" Harry asked, looking up at Slughorn. "Oh, the Three Broomstick and I go way back. Longer than I'd care to admit. In fact, I remember when it was simply one broomstick." As Professor Slughorn guffaws, Harry joins in, laughing heartily as well. Professor Slughorn's belly trembles next to Hermione's cheek and his waving mug sloshes over, spattering the table. "Oops. All hands on deck, Granger." Hermione smiles thinly when a whistle is heard and the rag is back, whisking away Professor Slughorn's mess as the skinny kid slides 3 foaming mugs onto the table. "Listen, boy. In the old days, I used to throw together the occasional supper and invite a select student or two. Would you two be game?" Professor Slughorn asked, looking at both Caden and Harry. "Sure," Caden said, shrugging. "I'd consider it an honor, sir," Harry said, smiling. "You'd be welcome too, Granger," Professor Slughorn said. Hermione, in the midst of emptying her butterbeer in one long draw, slams down her mug, leaving behind a mustache. "Be delighted, sir." Caden huffs out a laugh, drinking his butterbeer. "Brilliant. Look for my owl," Professor Slughorn said, turning to leave. "Good to see you, Wallenby." Ron frowns as Professor Slughorn waddles away, turning to Harry. "What are you playing at?" "Dumbledore asked me to get to know him," Harry said, shrugging. "Get to know him?" Ron questioned. "Dunno, but it must be important. Otherwise Dumbledore wouldn't ask," Harry said, shrugging again. Slam. Ron turns, sees that Hermione has emptied his mug as well. Ron gestures to her upper lip. You've got a little." Without a thought, she flicks her tongue up, wiping it clean. Caden shakes his head, looking at Hermione with amusement. "Do you want mine now?" he asked, chuckling when Hermione smiled sheepishly at him. The snow falls heavily. Ron and Harry walk together, while Caden and Hermione trail several yards behind, throwing snowballs at each other with a smile on both faces. Caden lets a snowball hit him when he hears a scream, running around Harry and towards Katie and Leanne. He jumps up and takes Katie's ankle, catching her as she falls, pulling her into his arms. I warned her not to touch it," Leanne exclaimed. Caden pulls Katie against his chest, unwrapping the scarf around her neck for her to breathe easier, then whispers comforting words to her over and over until Katie's lids flutter and her body goes limp. A big hand was placed on his shoulder, making him look up and sees Hagrid, who nodded at him. Caden lets Hagrid take Katie away from his arms, watching Harry wrap the necklace Katie had touched with his scarf. "How did you know how to do that?" Ron asked, looking at Caden, who was still kneeled down on the snow, watching Hagrid walk away from them with Katie in his arms. "Madame Pomfrey," Caden answered, standing up from the snow. "Let's bring that to a professor," he said, pointing to the wrapped necklace. Harry nods, agreeing with him. "Yeah, let's go." The necklace lies green and glittering upon Professor McGonagall's desk. "You're sure Katie did not have this in her possession when she entered the Three Broomsticks, Leanne?" Professor McGonagall asked, looking at her. Leanne nods. "It's like I said. She went to the loo, and when she came back she had the package. She said it was important she deliver it." "Did she say to whom?" Professor McGonagall asked. Leanne shakes her head. "All right, Leanne. You may go," Professor McGonagall said, as Leanne exits. "Why is it always you three, when something happens?" she asked, looking at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "Caden doesn't get in trouble a lot, unless you count the making out." "Believe me, Professor, I've been asking myself the same question for 6 years," Ron said. Just then, Severus appears at the door, eyeing the four. "Severus," Professor McGonagall said. "Is this it?" Severus asked. Professor McGonagall nods. Severus takes his wand and lifts the necklace like a dead snake, eyeing it with fascination. What do you think? Professor McGonagall asked. I think Miss Bell is lucky to be alive, Severus said, glancing at Caden, who was leaning against the chair with his arms crossed against his chest. She was cursed, wasn't she? I know, Katie. Off the Quidditch pitch, she wouldn't hurt a fly. If she was bringing that to someone, she wasn't doing it knowingly, Harry said. Severus eyes Harry levelly. Yes, she was cursed, Professor McGonagall said. It was Malfoy, Harry said. That's a very serious accusation, Potter, Professor McGonagall said. Indeed. Your evidence? Severus asked. I just know, Harry said, unsure. You just know. Once again you astonish with your gifts, Potter, gifts mere mortals could only dream of possessing. How grand it must be to be the chosen one, Severus said. Ron and Hermione avert their eyes uncomfortably. I suggest you return to your dormitory. All of you, Professor McGonagall said. Caden nods, standing up. Good night, Professor McGonagall, Severus. Good night, Caden, Severus said. Good night, Mr. Potter, Professor McGonagall said, giving Caden a small smile. 55. Professor Slughorn stands at the head of a table, a goblet raised to the students seated before him, which in addition to Caden, Harry, and Hermione include Marcus Belby, Blaise Zabini, Marcus Sawyer, Neville Longbottom, and the twins. A distinctive crystal hourglass sits in the center of the table. To Hogwarts' best and brightest, Professor Slughorn said, smiling. Here, Cormac said, winking at Caden with a small smirk, not losing his smirk when Caden only rolls his eyes at him. If he can't get with Caden, then he can playfully flirt with him. No harm in that, right? Hermione exchanges a wry glance with Harry, who notices that one setting is empty. The twins make and drink their toast in perfect unison. Neville stares hopelessly at the vast array of forks, knives, and spoons placed beside his plate. Which one do I use for the soup? He questioned, smiling gratefully at his boyfriend as he explained what all of the cutlery is for. Caden grins at the boyfriends, looks up, and gets another wink from Cormac. He shakes his head, getting a smile from Cormac, who notices the faint smile on his face. So tell me, Cormac, see much of your Uncle Tiberius these days? Professor Slughorn asked sometime later. Yes, sir. In fact, I'm meant to go hunting with him and the Minister for Magic over holiday. Cormac answered. Well, be sure to give them both my best. What about your uncle, Belby? Working on anything new? Professor Slughorn looks to the others. For those of you who don't know, Marcus' uncle invented the Wolfsbane potion. As he speaks, Belby never once looks up from his plate. Dunno. He and me Dad don't get on. Probably because Dad thinks potions are rubbish. Says the only potion worth having is a stiff one at the end of the day. And you, Miss Granger? What is it your family does in the Muggle world? Professor Slughorn asked, looking at Hermione. My parents are dentists. They tend to people's teeth. Hermione answered, seeing Caden smile at the corner of her vision, confused but not confused at the same time. Fascinating. And is that considered a dangerous profession? Professor Slughorn asked. No. Though, a boy named Robbie Fenwick did bite my father once. Needed 10 stitches, Hermione said, not jumping when Caden leans towards her and whispers something into her ear. Her eyes widened, and with a small blush, pulled back from Caden, who was giggling uncontrollably, obviously proud at what he had whispered to her. Harry was confused, but there's still a smile on his face as Caden slowly calmed himself down, wiping the tears in his eyes. The door suddenly groans open, and everyone turns. Miss Weasley. Come in, come in. Professor Slughorn said. Sorry, I'm not ordinarily late. Ginny falters, eyes red, uncharacteristically flustered. No matter. You'll be just in time for dessert. That is, if Belby leaves you any. Professor Slughorn said. As Ginny moves to her seat, Hermione whispers to Harry, knowing that Caden can hear her. Look at her eyes. They've been fighting again. Her and Dean. Harry nods, then stands as Ginny reaches the table, the only one. Caden and Hermione notice him, and while Hermione eyes him with amusement, Caden is looking at him with a small smile as Harry sits back down.
What?
Harry asked, looking at Hermione. Hermione shakes her head with a small smile. Nothing. So, how was it? Ron asked, sitting down next to Caden, who was reading a letter from both Cedric and Victor with a dreamy smile. Hermione continues to read the prophet, unaware of Ron's mood. How was what? Your dinner party, Ron said with mock refinement, gaining Caden's attention, who looks up from the letter. Dead boring. Though I think Harry enjoyed dessert, Hermione said, glaring at Caden when she sees a smile slowly appearing on the Hufflepuff's face. Don't. Caden looks offended by that. I didn't say anything. Don't. Hermione repeats, shaking her head, puffing out a laugh when Caden pouts at her. Professor Slughorn is having a Christmas do, you know? Caden said, moving on from his topic. And we're meant to bring someone. I expect you'll be going with McLaggen. Isn't he a member of the Slug Club? Ron said to Hermione. Actually, I was going to ask you, Hermione said. Really? Ron asked. Really? But seeing as you have such a distaste for the idea, Hermione's words was cut off by Lavender, who was passing by. Good luck today, Ron. I know you'll be brilliant, Lavender said. Ron sighs, looking back down at his plate, not noticing Hermione staring daggers at Lavender. I'm resigning. After today's match, McLaggen can have my spot, Ron said. Hearing this, Hermione turns back. Harry catches her eye, extends a shaking hand to indicate Ron's mental state. Make it your way. Juice? Harry asked. Hermione blinks, surprised by Harry's callousness. Ron is surprised as well, and mildly put out. Caden is not surprised, already knowing what Harry is planning. Sure, Ron said. As Harry pours the juice, Luna arrives at the table wearing a hat that bears an uncanny resemblance to a real lion. Hello, everyone. You look dreadful, Ron, Luna said. Ron nods grimly, lifts his glass to his mouth. Luna turns to Harry. Is that why you just put something in his cup? Is it a tonic? The tint vial of Felix Felicis glints in Harry's palm. Don't drink that, Ron, Hermione exclaimed. But Ron's frozen in mid-sip, looking at Harry's palm too. Quickly, he gulps down the rest. You could be expelled for that, Hermione said, glancing at Caden, who is reading the letters again. Dunno what you're talking about, Harry said, pocketing the vial, and winks at Luna. Ron stood up. Come on, Harry. We've got a game to win. Caden walks with Hermione through the library, Harry walking beside him. He's at perfect liberty to kiss whomever he likes. I really couldn't care less. Was I under the impression that he and I would be attending Slughorn's Christmas party together? Yes. Of course, now, given the circumstances, I've had to make other arrangements, Hermione said. Have you? Harry asked. Yes. Why? Hermione questioned, looking at Harry. I just thought, you know, since neither one of us can take who we'd really like, maybe we'd go together. As friends, Harry said. Hermione stops. Why didn't I think of that? So who are you taking? Caden asked, turning his head to look at Hermione. It's a surprise. Besides, it's you both we need to worry about. And you both can't pick just anyone. See that girl over there? That's Romilda Vane. Rumor has it she's trying to slip you both a love potion, Hermione said. Really? Harry said, considers a fine-boned girl with raven hair. Caden smacks the back of Harry's head, breaking him out of his staring. Hey, she's only interested in us because she thinks we're the chosen one, he said, shaking his head. But we are the chosen one, Harry said, dodging that hand that is from Caden. Hermione cocks her head at him, exasperated. Okay, kidding. I'll just ask someone I like. Someone cool, Harry said, looking at Caden, who is looking in front of him at a Slytherin. Who are you taking? Blaise Zabini, Caden answered. He started walking towards the Slytherin he was staring at, leaving a stunned Harry and an amused Hermione behind him. Hey, Blaise, he said, joining the boy, who looks up at him and gives him a small smile. Hello, Caden. What can I help you in this wonderful evening? Blaise said, placing down the book he is holding. Do you have someone to take to the Christmas party? Caden asked, cocking his head, making Blaise smile. The Slytherin shakes his head, looking down at Caden. Why do you ask? Wow, what a coincidence, me too, Caden said, grinning. Blaise huffs out a laugh, looking at Caden with amusement. Do you want to go together, then? Caden instantly nodded his eyes. I'll see you soon, Blaise. I'll see you soon, Caden, Blaise said, watching the Hufflepuff walk back to his friends with a bit of fondness. 56. Caden suddenly appears in front of Ginny and Harry, pointing his wand at the sky which darkens the clouds, and he points his wand in front of him at Greyback, knocking the werewolf back. He points his wand forward at the reeds, where he can hear Bellatrix's cackling carried through the night. The lightning disappears from his wand, turning to look at Ginny and Harry, who is looking at him with slightly widened eyes. Really, another spell? Ginny asked, looking at Caden. And since when can you apparate? Months ago, Caden said, shrugging, turning and starts walking out of the reeds with Ginny and Harry behind him. Oh dear, he said, looking up at the burning burrow. You're lucky you both weren't killed, Hermione said, reading the Daily Prophet as she walks alongside Caden and Harry. You have to realize who you both are. I know who we are, Hermione, all right? Harry said sharply, slumping down when Caden glares at him. Sorry. He apologizes to Hermione. So tell me what Arthur said. Hermione said, if Dumbledore's traveling places, it's news to the Ministry. But get this, that night at Borgin and Burke's, it seems Draco was looking at a vanishing cabinet. Harry said, what would Draco want with a vanishing cabinet? Hermione questioned, looking at Caden, who shrugs at her. You tell me, Harry said. Hermione frowns, pondering this. He looks different, don't you both think? Draco, almost ill. Who could tell the difference? Harry asked. Me and Harper. Caden answered without hesitation. He does look sick. Lav, come on. Of course I'll wear it. Ron said. Excuse me, I have to go vomit. Hermione said, leaving the twins behind her. Caden frowns, rolling his eyes at Ron and Lavender. Gosh, I'm gonna be sick, he said, following Hermione. Caden, Harry, Professor Dumbledore, Severus, Professor McGonagall, Ginny, and a very somber Hermione circle Ron's bed as Madame Pomfrey ministers to him. Professor Slughorn sits off to the side, in a chair, looking stunned. Quick thinking on your part, Harry. Using a bezoar. You must be very proud of your student, Horace? Professor Dumbledore said. HM. Oh, yes, very proud. Professor Slughorn said. I think we all agree that Mr. Potter's actions were heroic. The question is, why were they necessary? Professor McGonagall said. Why indeed? Professor Dumbledore said, taking the half-empty bottle of mead, still bearing a bit of gift wrap. This appears to be a gift, Horace. You don't by chance remember who gave you this bottle, do you? Which, by the way, possesses remarkably subtle hints of licorice and cherry when not polluted with poison. Actually, I had intended to give it as a gift myself, Professor Slughorn said. To whom might I ask? Professor Dumbledore questioned. You, Headmaster, Professor Slughorn said. Just then, the door bursts open by Lavender. Where is he? Where's my 1-1? Has he been asking for me? She stops, glaring daggers at Hermione. What's she doing here? I might ask you the same. Hermione retorted. I happen to be his girlfriend. Lavender answered. I happen to be his friend. Hermione said hesitantly. Don't make me laugh. You haven't spoken in weeks. I suppose you want to make up with him now that he's suddenly all interesting. Lavender said, crossing her arms. He's been poisoned, you daft dimbo. And for the record, I've always found him interesting. Hermione frowns, a bit embarrassed. Ron snorts, stirring. Huh. See? He senses my presence. I'm here, 1-1. I'm here, air. My. Nay. Air. My. Nay. Ron, in a haze, reaches out blindly. Blushing, Hermione takes his wand. Instantly, he falls unconscious again. Lavender, vibrating with rage, stalks out. Professor Dumbledore beams. Ah, to be young and feel love's keen sting. Come, everyone. I think Mr. Weasley is well tended. As Professor Dumbledore leads the others past Harry, Harry studies him. Ginny passes, face very close, whispering as she indicates Ron and Hermione. "About time, don't you think?" Ginny asked. Harry watches her go, hopelessly smitten, noticing that Professor Slughorn has paused in the doorway. "I've always cherished my students. They're my life," Professor Slughorn said. "Then he is gone too." Harry turns back, studying Hermione, hand enfolded over Ron's. She looks up, noticing his faint smile. "Oh, shut up," Hermione said, rolling her eyes lightly. Caden looks up, watching Harry, who is running after Draco. He stood up as well, running after Harry. He sees Harry turn into a corridor and runs towards him, noticing that they're approaching a bathroom. By the time he arrives at the bathroom, he sees Draco laying down on the floor with blood spurting from his face. The water is red with Draco's blood. Caden breaks out of his staring and moves towards Draco, taking out his wand and starts waving it over Draco's wound, murmuring an incantation. Instantly, the skin begins to knit itself together. Caden turns his head away from Draco, looking at Harry, who is slowly backing away. He was about to stand up when a hand gripped his arm, kneeling back down next to Draco as he looked at the blonde who was looking up at him. "Stay, please," Draco said, begging Caden to stay with his eyes. "I will," Caden said, sitting down on the wet floor just as Sirius enters the bathroom, looking at him and Draco with curiosity. "He was hurt by your Half-Blood Prince book. Why does he have it?" Draco asked, sitting up with the Hufflepuff's help. "He didn't have the book needed for Professor Slughorn's class," Caden answered, looking down at his wet clothes. "Oh dear." Draco stood up, helping Caden up. "We should go change." Caden nods, agreeing with him. He looks at Sirius, gripping his hand as he walks by him with Draco behind him, happy that he got his friendship with Caden again. 57. Caden walks around the corridor, patrolling. He is still a prefect after all. He turns his head at the exact time he sees someone walk by. He sighs and starts walking after the student. He was surprised to see that the student is Harry. Guess he'll just follow Harry and see what he's doing, and if he has good reason to be out so late. Mr. Filch and Mrs. Norris passed Harry, who was unseen by the caretaker and his cat. Caden stops, watching Harry kneel down, extending his hand to the ground and doing something just as the oars pass over him and vanish. Harry stood up, walking in a direction, but stopped at the last second and headed the opposite way. Caden listens to Harry's hums, still following after him with his wand out, just in case there's danger in the corner of the corridor. He stops when he sees Professor Slughorn hunched over a plant, approaching Harry and Professor Slughorn, the latter having noticed Harry when the Gryffindor looks over his shoulder. "Merlin's beard, Harry," Professor Slughorn exclaimed, jumping in surprise at the sight of the Gryffindor. He takes notice of the Hufflepuff prefect, who is slowly approaching them. "Caden," he greeted, nodding. Caden returns the gesture, looking at Harry, who is looking at him with a smile before the Gryffindor turns his attention to Professor Slughorn. "Sorry, sir. I should have announced myself. Cleared my throat. Coughed. You probably feared I was Madam Sprout," Harry said. "Well, yes, actually," Professor Slughorn cuts himself off, looking down at Harry. "Why would you think that?" "Just the general behavior, sir. The sneaking around. The jumping when you saw us. By the way, those tentacula leaves, they're quite valuable, aren't they?" Harry asked. Caden raised an eyebrow at Professor Slughorn. "10 galleons a leaf to the right buyer. Not that I'm familiar with such back-alley transactions. One hears rumors is all. My own interests are purely academic, of course," Professor Slughorn said, giving the prefect a small smile. "Personally, these plants have always kind of freaked me out," Harry said truthfully, giving a little shiver of the shoulders and smiles. Caden and Professor Slughorn cocked their heads, studying the Gryffindor oddly. "Exactly how did you get out of the castle, Harry?" Professor Slughorn asked. "Through the front doors, sir. I'm off to Hagrid's, you see. He's a very dear friend and I felt like paying him a visit. So if you don't mind, I'll be going," Harry said, starting to walk away from Caden and Professor Slughorn, who looks at each other. "Harry," Professor Slughorn exclaimed, stopping the Gryffindor. "Sir?" Harry questioned, turning to look at Caden and Professor Slughorn. "It's nearly nightfall. Surely you realize we can't allow you to roam the grounds all by yourself," Professor Slughorn said. "Well, then by all means come along," Harry said, walking away. Caden and Professor Slughorn look at each other again, then sigh and trail after the Gryffindor. "Harry, I must insist you accompany me back to the castle immediately." Professor Slughorn, huffing and puffing to keep up with Harry. He was glad to have Caden walking beside him, just in case he decided to fall over. "That would be counterproductive, sir," Harry said. "And what makes you say that?" Caden asked. "No idea," Harry answered, shrugging. Professor Slughorn frowns, then stops, blinking at the sight in front of him. Merlin's beard. Up ahead, Hagrid sits disconsolately upon a stump. Nearby, Aragog's massive body lies legs up. "Is that an actual acromantula?" Professor Slughorn asked, stunned. "A dead one, I think, sir," Harry said, starting to walk towards a sullen Hagrid with Caden and Professor Slughorn behind him. "Airy, Caden." "Oris," Hagrid greeted sullenly. "My God, dear man, how did you ever manage to kill it?" Professor Slughorn asked. "Kill him? Me oldest friend, he was," Hagrid exclaimed. Professor Slughorn winces. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." Hagrid waves his hand. Don't worry yourself. You're not alone. Seriously misunderstood creatures, spiders. It's the eyes, I reckon. Unnerved people. Not to mention the pincers." Harry makes a little claw motion with his wands, while making a clicking sound. Hagrid eyes Harry curiously. "I reckon that too. How'd you get out of the castle anyways?" "Through the front doors," Harry answered. "Hagrid, I wouldn't want to be indelicate, but acromantula venom is uncommonly rare and, well, if you wouldn't mind my extracting a vial or two, purely for academic pursuits." Professor Slughorn said. "Don't suppose it's doing him any good, is it?" Hagrid said. "My thoughts exactly. Always carry a few spare ampoules for just such occasions. Old potion master's habit, you know?" Professor Slughorn said, rummaging about his pockets and extracts some small vials, all empty save for one containing a hairy worm, then scrambles up close to Aragog. Caden, Harry, and Hagrid watch him. Wish ya could have seen him in his prime. Magnificent he was. Just magnificent. Hagrid blinks wildly, then takes out a handkerchief and snorts loudly into it. Professor Slughorn looks up, studying Hagrid's sorry expression with empathy, and steps away. "Why don't I say a few words? I trust he had a family?" "Oh yeah," Harry answered. Professor Slughorn clears his throat. "Farewell." He started but frowned, not knowing what the acromantula name was. "Aragog," Caden and Hagrid answered. Professor Slughorn nodded. "Farewell, Aragog, King of Arachnids. Though your body will decay, your spirit lingers on in the quiet, web-spun places of your forest home. May your many-eyed descendants ever flourish and your human friends find solace for the loss they have sustained." Caden wipes his eyes with his sleeves, sniffing. The was beautiful," Hagrid said, wiping his eyes, then rises. He walks to Aragog, studies him lovingly, then puts a shoulder to the big beast's body and sends him tumbling into the freshly dug grave adjacent with a sickening thunk. And Odo the hero, they bore him back home. Hagrid and Professor Slughorn sing. Caden is looking at them with a small smile, while Harry is focused on something. To the place he'd known as a lad, they laid him to rest, his hat inside out and his wand snapped in two, which was sad. As they finish, both men chuckle. Hagrid tops off everyone's mug with a bit more wine. Harry brings his mug to his lap, then slyly pours it into Caden's mug, who huffs out a laugh at him. "I had him from an egg, you know. Tiny little thing he was when he hatched. No bigger in a Pekingese," Hagrid said, making Caden smile. "Sweet. I once had a fish. Francis. Lovely little thing. One day I came downstairs and he'd vanished." "Poof," Professor Slughorn said. "That's odd," Hagrid said. "Isn't it? That's life, I suppose. One goes along and then, poof." Professor Slughorn said. "Poof," Hagrid said. "Poof," Caden and Harry said. They all nod soberly. Professor Slughorn's eyes rise to the ceiling. "That's never unicorn hair, Hagrid?" Hagrid looks up, reels a bit, and nods. "But my dear chap, Do you know how much that's worth? Professor Slughorn asked. No idea. No idea at all, Hagrid said. His head hits the table. Instantly, he is snoring, so deeply his mug shimmies across the table. Professor Slughorn smiles, regarding Caden and Harry. The latter merely stares back. Professor Slughorn averts his eyes. Suddenly nervous. The wind rises outside. Window panes rattling. It was a student who gave me Francis. One spring afternoon I discovered a bowl upon my desk with a few inches of clear water. There was a flower petal floating upon the surface. As I watched, the petal sank, but just before it touched bottom, it transformed into a wee fish. It was beautiful magic, wondrous to behold. The petal had come from a lily, Professor Slughorn said, nodding when Caden and Harry looked at him. Your mother. The day I came downstairs, the day I found the bowl empty, was the day she? Professor Slughorn falters, pain etching his face. I know what you want, but I can't give it to you. It will ruin me. Harry studies Professor Slughorn for a moment, thinking, then speaks. Do you know why we survived? The night I got this. Professor Slughorn looks up, seeing Harry pointing to his scar. Because of her. Because she sacrificed herself. Because she refused to step aside. Because her love was more powerful than Voldemort. Harry said, please don't say his. I'm not afraid of the name, Professor. And I'm not afraid of him. And you shouldn't be either. She didn't just die for us that night. She died for you too. She died for everyone who's ever woken in the middle of the night, afraid a Death Eater waited on their doorstep. Harry said. Professor Slughorn gazes into the guttering candle before him. Professor, I'm going to tell you something. Something others have only guessed at. It's true. We are the chosen one, Harry said, nodding when Professor Slughorn looks up. Only we can kill him. But in order to do so, I need to know what Tom Riddle asked you that night in your office all those years ago. And I need to know what you told him, Harry said. Professor Slughorn's eyes well with tears. His hands tremble. Be brave, Professor. Be brave like our mother. Otherwise you disgrace her. Otherwise she died for nothing. Otherwise, the bowl remains empty forever, Harry said. Professor Slughorn shakes his head, staring into the candle. Finally, slowly, he removes his wand. Don't think too badly of me once you've seen it. You don't know what he was like, even then. Professor Slughorn fishes out a tiny vial, the one with the worm. But his hand is shaking so violently, Harry has to take it. Slowly, Slughorn raises his wand, touches it to his temple, and withdraws a long, silver thread. Harry extends the vial and it drops within. Harry looks at Caden, who drinks the rest of his drink and stands up. Let's go. I'll lead you to Dumbledore's office, Caden said, looking at Harry, who nodded at him and started following him out of Hagrid's hut. Once they arrive at the entrance of Dumbledore's office, Caden turns to Harry. Good luck, Harry, he said. Thanks, Harry said, watching Caden down the corridor, still doing his prefect patrols. 58. Hermione. Is the room of requirement unplottable? Harry asked. Caden, him, Ron and Hermione walk the courtyard. If one wants it to be. Why? Hermione asked. It would explain why I thought Malfoy was leaving the castle when he disappeared off the map, Harry said. He was going to the room of requirement. Of course, and that explains the vanishing cabinet as well, Hermione exclaimed. No, I got an owl from Dad this morning. The one at Borgin and Burke's? It's still there, Ron said. But I'm telling you, I saw it. Harry was cut off by Caden. What if there are two vanishing cabinets? Caden said, looking at them. What if there are? Hermione asked. I don't know, Harry said. Good luck, mate, Ron said. Harry turns back to Caden, Ron, and Hermione, neither able to fully conceal their concern. He smiles reassuringly, continuing on. I don't need luck. I'll be with Dumbledore. Caden looks up when the ground shakes, looking around at the students who are looking at him and Hannah for answers as to what's going on. Caden walks out of the common room, making his way up to the middle courtyard with the Hufflepuffs and Hannah behind him. He stops, looking in front of him with a stunned expression. The Hufflepuffs and Hannah stop as well, looking. Caden watches Harry kneel down next to Dumbledore. The man's eyes are closed, his face peaceful. Harry straightens his half-moon spectacles, wiping a trickle of blood from his mouth, running the back of his hand, gently, over the weathered cheek. Then he notices something lying beside Dumbledore's ashen hand. He takes it, considers it numbly. Caden sees Harry's body starting to shake and moves forward, dropping down beside him. At his touch, Harry's head falls on his shoulder, and he begins to stroke him. Professor McGonagall lifts a trembling wand to the sky, and slowly the tip glows to life. One after another, students and staff do the same, lifting their wands in salute. Caden, Harry, and Hermione stand by the ramparts while Ron and Ginny stand further along, just out of earshot. Harry stares into the distance at the ashen of Hagrid's hut. Hermione toys with the locket before them. "Do you think he would have done it, Draco?" Hermione asked. "No, he was lowering his wand. In the end, it was Snape. It was always Snape. And I did nothing," Harry said. Caden looks away from him, looking out onto the sky. Hermione studies Caden and Harry, taking the locket from the rampart. "Strange. Thinking this is a piece of Voldemort's soul." "Yes, strange. Only it's not. It's a fake," Harry said as Hermione reacts. Harry nods. "Go on. Open it." Hermione pries open the locket and removes a piece of parchment folded in a tight square. "To the Dark Lord. I know I will be dead long before you read this, but I want you to know that it was I who discovered your secret. I have stolen the real horcrux and intend to destroy it as soon as I can. I face death in the hope that when you meet your match, you will be mortal once more. R.A.B. She looks up. R.A.B. Dunno. But whoever they are, they have the real horcrux. Which means it was a waste. All of it," Harry said. Hermione studies Harry's troubled face, then glances at Ginny and Ron. "Ron's okay with it, you know. You and Ginny. But if I were you, when he's around, I'd keep the snogging to a minimum." She smiles faintly, trying to cheer him on, but Harry merely nods, looking away again. "I'm not coming back, Hermione," Harry said, finally glancing at Caden, who is still looking up at the sky. But he knows Caden is thinking the same thing as him. Hermione nods. "We reckoned, Ron and me. We have to finish what Dumbledore started. We're not sure where that will lead us, but we'll let you and Ron know where we are, when we can," Harry said. "I've always admired your courage, Harry, but sometimes you're really thick," Hermione said to Harry. Caden was looking at Harry as if he's insane. "That's why." Harry turns, looking at her in surprise. "You don't honestly think you can find all those horcruxes by yourself, do you?" Hermione stops Harry before he can open his mouth, leaning in to whisper to him. "You need us, Harry." Harry just stares at her. She cocks her head, smiling, doing her best to coax one out of him. Finally, he does, briefly. "Yeah, I do. But do me a favor. When I'm around, keep the snogging to a minimum," Harry said, watching in silent amusement when Hermione reddens. "Like that's going to happen," Hermione said, glancing at Ron, shaking her head. "Besides, he's barking." "Funny, he says the same about you," Harry said, glancing at Caden, who is trying his best to hide his smile. "Yes, but I'm exceptionally perceptive," Hermione said. "You're brilliant. You both are," Harry said, looking off again. Hermione follows his gaze, looking out over the grounds. "Do you think we'll ever?" She stops, eyes glistening briefly. Then she fights it back. Harry fights back his own emotion, reaches over and gives her hand a brief squeeze, then releases her. "I don't know," he admits, looking at Caden, who turns his head to look at him. Hermione nods and Harry's eyes shift, considering Ron and Ginny. As if sensing his gaze, Ron turns and they exchange a look, something unspoken but true passing between them. Just then a song rises on the air, mournful and haunting. And seconds later a bird soars out from beyond the tallest turret and begins to stitch its way across the sky. Ron and Ginny cross to Caden, Harry, and Hermione, leaning against the rampart. All look to the horizon, watching the bird grow smaller while its song, magically, endures. No one says a word. 59, 7th year. Caden looks around the house that he has called home for 2 years, looking up at the portrait of painting of him and Severus in front of him. He takes his wand on the table, placing it in his pocket, and turns around. He walks towards the door and closes the door behind him, placing the keys under the flower pot. He walks to the back of his house and takes the broom, gifted from Severus when he decides to play Quidditch, and climb onto it. There's only one location in his mind as he starts flying up to the sky, above the cloud where muggles wouldn't be able to see him if they look up. He enjoys the wind blowing against his face, finding peace in flying even though he's so high up. He looks at the sunset, flying faster to get to the Dursleys' house in time. He lands right as Hagrid's land, smiling at the man who returns the smile. He grunts when arms are wrapped around him, rubbing Hermione back, who pulls away from him to look at him. "You cut your hair?" Hermione asked, surprised filling her face. "It was getting too annoying," Caden said, shrugging. "Now, go and meet Harry," he said, looking over Hermione's shoulder and smile at the sight of his boyfriends. Hermione looks at him knowingly, patting his cheeks, and starts walking to the front door where Harry is waiting for them. Caden moves towards his boyfriends, pecking both of them, and gives them an apologetic smile when they look down at him for more. Later, he mouthed, winking at them, who smiled at him, and followed him to the front door where Harry was looking at him and his boyfriends with a small smile. "Hey, brother," he said, wrapping his arms around Harry and patting his back before pulling away. "Hello, Caden," Harry said, smiling at both Cedric and Victor, who both patted his back in greetings. Caden looks at the people in the Dursley house. There are Fred, George, Bill, Fleur, Tonks, Lupin, Arthur, Moody, Kingsley, Sirius, Cedric, Victor, and Mundungus Fletcher. Lastly, Hagrid dismounts a motorbike, stripping a pair of fly-specked goggles from his face, and yanks a small twittering bird from his beard. "All right, Harry? Ya look fit," Hagrid said. "Yeah, he's got ruddy gorgeous. What say we get undercover before someone murders him?" Moody said. Everyone spills down the hallway into the sitting room. "I thought you were looking after the Prime Minister, Kingsley," Harry said. "You're more important," Kingsley answered, nodding to Caden, who stood between his boyfriends. Harry grins, then a tall, red-headed man is before him, hand extended. His face is scarred. "Hello, Harry. Bill Weasley," Bill said, looking at Caden. "We've already met." Caden nods, smiling at the man. "Wasn't always this handsome," Fred said. "Dead ugly," George said. Bill smiles. "True enough. Owe it all to a werewolf by name of Greyback. Hope to repay the favor one day." Fleur kisses Bill on the cheek. "You are still beautiful to me, William. Just remember, Fleur, once you're married." Bill takes his stakes on the raw side now. Lupin said, "My husband, the Joker. By the way, wait until you hear the news. Remus and I are." Tonks was cut off by Moody. All right. You'll all have time for a cozy catch-up later. We've got to get the hell out of here, and soon." Moody drops some sacks at his feet, turning to Caden and Harry. "Potters, you're underage, which means you both still got the trace on you both." "The trace?" Harry questioned, looking at Caden. "We sneeze and the Ministry will know who wipes our nose," Caden answered, making Cedric smile in amusement at the explanation. "Point is, we have to use those means of transport the trace can't detect, brooms, thestrals, and the like. We'll go in pairs. That way, if anyone's out there waiting for us, and I reckon there will be, they won't know which Caden and Harry Potter are the real ones." Moody said. "The real one?" Harry questioned, looking at Caden again. Moody draws 2 flasks from his cloak. "I believe you both are familiar with this particular brew." "No, absolutely not," Harry quickly protested. Hermione sighs. "I told you he'd take it well. If you think I'm going to let people risk their lives for us, never done that before, have we?" Ron asked. "This is different. Taking that. Becoming us, no," Harry said, turning to look at Caden. "And you're fine with this?" Caden sighs. "There are some things you have to sacrifice to win a war," he said, looking at Harry, who slumped down. "Well, none of us really fancy it, mate," Fred said. "Yeah. Imagine if something went wrong and we were stuck as scrawny, Specky gets forever," George said. "Everyone here's of age, Potter, and they've all agreed to take the risk." Moody said. Technically, I've been coerced, Mundungus said, turning to Harry and extending his hand. Mundungus Fletcher, Mr. Potter. I've always been a huge admirer. Nip it, Mundungus. All right, Granger, as discussed. Caden, Moody exclaimed, turning to Caden while Hermione plucked Harry's hair. Caden reaches up to his head, pulls a hair out and places it inside the flask, walking back to stand between his boyfriends. Mad Eye holds out the flasks, unstoppered now. The potions inside begin to spit forth smoke. He hands Harry's flask to George and Caden's flask to Fred. For those of you who haven't taken Polyjuice potion before, fair warning. It tastes like goblin piss. Have a lot of experience with that, do you, Mad Eye? Fred asked. Moody's eye rotates menacingly onto Fred. Just trying to defuse the tension, Fred said, giving the flask to Fleur while George gives his to Ron. At the end, there are 4 Harry and 3 Caden, not counting the real Caden and Harry. This is weird, Caden muttered, looking at his boyfriends who are both him and Harry. Wow, we're finally not identical, Fred and George said, looking at each other. Moody pulls the ties on the sacks and pulls out 9 identical outfits. Don't have something a bit more sporty, do you? George asked, taking Harry's clothes. This is nice, Fred said, taking Caden's clothes. Fancy this. You're not you, so shut it and strip, Moody said. You both will need to change too, Potters. Caden starts to strip down, taking off his clothes and pants, leaving him in his underwear. He takes his clothes from the ground, putting it on. Hermione wobbles a bit. Harry, your eyesight really is awful. Blimey, I almost forgot, Moody said, rummages in his pocket and pulls out a fistful of glasses. Right then, we'll be pairing off. Each Potter will have a protector. As for you, Caden and Harry. Yes, everyone said. The real Caden and Harry. Where the devil are you, anyway? Moody asked. Caden raised his hand, placing his wand inside his pocket. Here, Harry said. Moody's eye rotates onto the real Caden, then Harry. Harry, you'll ride with Hagrid. Caden with Sirius. Brought ya here 16 years ago when you were barely bigger than a bowtruckle. Seems only right I should be the one to take ya away, Hagrid said, as Caden moves to stand next to Sirius. I'll protect you like before, old man, Caden said jokingly, making Sirius chuckle at the nickname. Just don't die this time, Sirius said, patting Caden's back. Yeah, it's all very touching. Let's go, Moody said, walking out of the Dursleys' home with everyone following after him. 60. The other Cadens and Harrys sit upon thestrals and brooms. Hagrid sits astride a motorbike, goggles on. Caden takes Sirius' hand and makes himself comfortable on the thestral, taking out his wand just in case they have a fight. He knows they will, and he won't let Sirius die. He'll make sure of that. They take off into the air, and instantly a disturbance fills the air. Caden looks up as Death Eaters begins to drop from the clouds, surrounding the others. Flashes of green light splinter the darkness. Caden sees a Death Eater approaching him and Sirius, and waves his wand at them. Yellow light bursts from his wand, knocking the Death Eater back. He turns his head left and right to see if there's any danger coming towards them, and instantly multiple Death Eaters move towards them. Caden held tight onto Sirius while waving his wand towards the Death Eaters. Satisfied when the Death Eaters got knocked down, he sees a green spell moving towards them. Knowing that it's the killing curse, he uses his protection spell and deflect the spell onto the Death Eater that throws the spell towards them. Hold tight, Sirius shouts over the wind, swooping down. Caden wraps both of his arms around Sirius, and the thestral lands safely onto the grounds. He slid down the thestral, Sirius following after him as they started walking towards Harry and Hagrid. Harry turns and wraps his arms around Caden and Sirius, relieved that they're both alive and well. A door opens in a crooked house. 2 silhouettes appear, dashing forward. It's Mrs. Weasley and Ginny. Harry, Caden, what happened? Have you seen the others? Mrs. Weasley asked, frantic. Is no one back yet? Sirius asked, looking from Mrs. Weasley to Ginny. Ginny shakes her head. They were on us from the start, Molly, the Death Eaters. And you know who as well, Hagrid said. Mrs. Weasley's face betrays panic, but she fights it back. Well, thank goodness you four are all right. Haven't go any brandy, have ye, Molly? Fair medicinal purposes? Hagrid asked. Mrs. Weasley nods, leading him towards the house. Once out of earshot, Harry turns expectantly to Ginny. Ginny looks frightened. Ron and Tonks should have already been back. Dad and Fred as well. Suddenly, several yards away, a blue light burns in the darkness. Caden, Harry, Ginny, and Sirius rush towards it just as Lupin materializes, cradling an unconscious Harry, clothes torn, head awash in blood. Harry takes in the surreal tableau, then watches himself transform into George, who bears the true damage. Ginny's hands fly to her face. Oh my God, George! The house! Quickly! Lupin exclaimed. Sirius and Lupin drop George onto the sofa, where his head rolls into the lamplight, the blood more shocking here. Mrs. Weasley screams. George's ear is gone. My boy. My darling boy. What VE they done to you? Harry looks on miserably, anger and guilt clashing within him. When Lupin grabs a fistful of Caden and his shirt and hurls them against the wall. Remus, what are you doing? Ginny exclaimed. Sirius moves forward to try and stop Remus. What creature sat in the corner the first time that Harry Potter visited my office at Hogwarts? Lupin exclaimed before turning to Caden. What is your second profession that you've told me? Are you mad? Harry questioned. Healer. Caden answered. What creature? Lupin shouts, letting Caden go. A Grindylow. Harry exclaimed. Lupin releases Harry, turning back to the others. We've been betrayed. Voldemort knew you were being moved tonight. I had to make sure you both weren't an imposter. Who did this to him? Caden asked, crossing his arms over his chest. Snape, Lupin said, and Caden closed his eyes at this. He'll be fine, Molly. But that's dark magic. The damage is done. Mrs. Weasley nods, weeping, dabbing at George's face. A blue glow glimmers against the window, where Hagrid stands. Someone else is back, Hagrid said. Hermione and Kingsley stand together, looking shaken. As the others rush forward, Kingsley points his wand at Lupin. The last words Albus Dumbledore spoke to the pair of us? Kingsley asked. Caden and Harry are the best hope we have. Trust them, Lupin answered. Kingsley lowers his wand, wheeling on Harry. What gave you away? Hedwig, I think. She was trying to protect me. Just then, the yard glows with blue light and one pair after another materializes. Fred and Mr. Weasley, Bill and Fleur, Ron and Tonks, Cedric and Victor. Caden doesn't hesitate to move forward and wraps his arms around his boyfriend's necks, who wraps their arms around him. We're all right, Cedric mutters, closing his eyes. He's right, Victor said, letting Caden pull away first as the three of them walk to the burrow. Mr. Weasley, trailed by the others, stops dead. Mrs. Weasley looks up, her face saying it all. Fred comes up on his father's shoulder, eyes stinging with tears as he sees his brother. As if sensing them, George stirs. How do you feel, Georgie? Fred asked. Saint-like. George answered. Come again? Fred said. George opens his eyes, lifting blood-crusted fingers, and points to the dark cavity in the side of his skull. Saint-like. You see, I'm holy. Holy, Fred. Get it? With the whole wide world of irrelated humor at your disposal, you go for holy? Pathetic. Fred said. Reckon I'm still better looking than you. Better looking than Bill, that's for sure. George said. Bill doesn't smile. Next to him, Fleur looks equally grim. Mad Eye's dead. The room goes still. Mundungus took one look at Voldemort and disappeared. Bill said, Mad Eye reckon you know who would expect the real Caden, or Harry, to be with the most skilled Auror. He knew he'd be in the most danger. Sirius said, sighing softly. It doesn't explain how they knew we were moving Caden and Harry tonight. Mr. Weasley questioned. The room grows quiet, eyes shifting onto one another. Wah, one of us? This mad. I'd wager me life it was none of you lot. And if was me I'd know, wouldn't I? Talkin' me sleep on occasion, I'll admit. But there's only fong around her here and mostly it's gibberish and besides I'd cut me tongue out fire de betray Caden and airy Ian in me dreams. Hagrid stops, blinking miserably. Suddenly, everyone smiles. What's so funny? Hagrid exclaimed. We trust you with our life, Hagrid. We trust everyone in this room. Understood? Harry asked, glancing at Caden who is nodding at him. Caden has always shown it through action, while his through words. Understood. Lupin said. Ear. George said. Oh my goodness. Caden mutters under his breath, placing his head in his hand, making George smile proudly. Fred nods approvingly to his brother, smiling at Caden's reaction. Better. 61. Caden's suit. Book of Ancient Spells. Caden's diary. Caden looks in the mirror, tightening up his tie and fixing his hair. He takes the invisibility ring from the table beside the mirror into his hands, fiddling with it. He looks down at the ring before slipping it into his right fourth finger. He looks down at the table again, where the badge for the head boy rests. He took it into his palm, looking at it for a few seconds before placing it inside his pocket. He sighs, turning around and walks out of the bedroom, walking down the burrow stairs into the living room where he meets up with Mrs. Weasley. Oh, look at you, dear, Mrs. Weasley said, smiling as she looked at Caden. You dress up nicely. Thank you, Mrs. Weasley, Caden said, giving her a small, genuine smile. Mrs. Weasley nods, smiling softly. Cedric and Victor are waiting for you outside. Caden nods. I'm gonna go see them, he said, nodding to her as she nodded at him with a smile, turning around and starts walking out of the door. There's our flower, Cedric said, wearing a formal suit of his own, grinning brightly as he looks at his approaching boyfriend. Caden smiles, pecking both of them on the cheek as a greeting. You both look wonderful, he said, pulling back from them. So do you, Victor said, not letting Caden pull away as he places the boy between them. This is my third time wearing a suit, Caden said, looking in front of him where he can see Mr. Weasley gives them instructions on what to do. When was the second one? Cedric questioned, turning his head to look at Caden. When I was attacked by the Dementors, Caden answered. Plural? Cedric said, eyes widening slightly. He thought it was a single Dementor, not multiple. Plural. Caden repeated, nodding. It is horrible that it happens to you both, Victor said, and notices that Caden is not looking at him anymore, but rather something behind him, or someone. Caden looks at the tall wizard with grizzled hair and scarred cheek with confusion, wondering what's the Minister of Magic doing here. What's he doing here? Cedric questioned, looking at the man as well. Who is he? Victor asked, looking at Cedric. Rufus Scrimgeour. Caden and Harry enter the sitting room. Trailing behind them are Ron and Hermione. Rufus Scrimgeour gestures the four to the sofa. To what do we owe the pleasure, Minister? Harry asked, sitting down. I think we both know the answer to that question, Mr. Potter, Mr. Scrimgeour said, pitching a cloth bag onto the table before them. The quartet regards it curiously, exchanging glances. And this would be? Harry questioned. Don't be coy, Mr. Potter, Mr. Scrimgeour said, turning to Ron. Mr. Weasley, would you say you were close to your former headmaster, Dumbledore? And me? I dunno. I reckon I was just another Weasley to him. He was always polite. And you, Miss Granger? How would you characterize your relationship? Mr. Scrimgeour asked, cutting Ron's words short. We were friendly, not close like Caden and Harry, but what's this all about? Caden asked, sending Hermione an apologetic look which she just waved off with a small smile. This, despite the fact that neither of your friends appear to have been particularly close to their recently deceased headmaster, he saw fit to remember them in his will. Now why do you suppose that would be? Mr. Scrimgeour asked. Caden, Harry, Ron and Hermione exchanged glances again. No idea. Harry was the one to answer. Come now, you don't expect me to believe? Mr. Scrimgeour reaches into his cloak, removing a scroll that reads, Herein is set forth the last will and testament of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. First, to Ronald Bilious Weasley, I leave my Deluminator, a device of my own making, in the hope that, when things seem most dark, it will show him the light. He removes a small silver object from the bag, and Ron takes it into his hand. Dumbledore left this? For me? Brilliant. What is it? Ron clicks it, and all the light rushes from the lamps into the deluminator, throwing the room into total darkness. He clicks it again, and light flies back to the lamps. Wicked. To Miss Hermione Jean Granger, I leave my copy of the Tales of Beetle the Bard, in the hope that she will find it entertaining and instructive. Mr. Scrimgeour reaches into the bag once again and retrieves a small book, its binding stained and peeling in places. Mum used to read me those. The Wizard and the Hopping Pot, Babbity-Rabbity and Her Cackling Stump, Ron said, noticing Harry and Hermione staring blankly at him except Caden. Oh, come on. Beetle stories are famous. Babbity-Rabbity? No? Mr. Scrimgeour eyes Ron with mild annoyance and continue talking. To Caden Severus Potter, Harry, Ron, and Hermione seem surprised by his full name, having not known the Hufflepuff's full name except the first alphabet. I leave the book of ancient spells. Within these pages, you will find the wisdom and power of ancient magic. Use it wisely and with a pure heart, for the path ahead will be fraught with challenges that only the brave and kind can overcome. Remember, true strength lies not in the spells you cast, but in the choices you make. He reaches into the bag and retrieves a big book with bindings on them. Caden took it and placed it on his lap, looking at the Hufflepuff symbol on the front of the book. To Harry James Potter, I leave the snitch he caught in his first Quidditch match at Hogwarts as a reminder of the rewards of perseverance and skill. Mr. Scrimgeour places the tint golden orb onto Harry's palm, where it glimmers dully. Harry studies it, then looks up. That's it then? Not quite. Dumbledore left you a second bequest, the Sword of Godric Gryffindor. Unfortunately, the Sword of Gryffindor was not Dumbledore's to give away. As an important historical artifact, it belongs to Harry. It belongs to Harry. It chose him. It came to him in the Chamber of Secrets when he most needed it, Hermione said. The sword may present itself to any worthy Gryffindor, Miss Granger. That does not make it that wizard's property. And in any event, the current whereabouts of the sword are unknown. Mr. Scrimgeour said. Excuse me? Harry said. The sword is missing, Scrimgeour said, and before Harry can pursue. I won't pretend to be your friend, Mr. Potter, but I assure you I'm not your enemy. You'll forgive me, Minister, but it's a little hard to tell the difference these days, Harry said. Dumbledore said something very similar the last time we spoke. Mr. Scrimgeour gazes out the window, eyes haunted. Where is your guard, sir? Hermione asked. I came alone. I don't really need them anymore. Mr. Scrimgeour turns and leaves the burrow. 62. The wedding party is in full swing. Caden, in his suit, stands on the periphery with Harry beside him, absently fingering his ring as Bill and Fleur twirl madly within a clapping circle of well-wishers. Caden's gaze drifts to Cedric and Victor. Cedric are laughing at something Victor had said. Hermione, who is in a stunning black silk dress. To Ron, who is ignoring everyone, his eyes focused entirely on Hermione. Far across the garden, Hagrid wins through the tables in his horrible hairy suit and presents a slice of cake to a pleased Madame Maxime. Nearby, Tonks, hand to her belly, leans forward and whispers something to Mrs. Weasley, who reacts with happy surprise. We want you to be the godfather, Remus said to Harry. The Potters twins turn and see Remus behind them, staring at Tonks with affection. As his eyes shift to Harry, Harry sputters, making Caden smile. You mean, but that's brilliant. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Remus said, grinning and clapping Harry on the shoulder, nodding to Caden, and hikes off into the darkness, joining the wizards standing guard in the garden's deepest shadows. Caden looks back to Tonks, then notices a slight, tuffy-haired wizard sitting alone at a table just beyond him. Hello, Caden and Harry, Luna said, approaching in the company of a cross-eyed wizard with shoulder-length white hair, the texture of candy floss. Both wear robes the color of egg yolk. Oh, I've interrupted a deep thought, haven't I? I can see it growing smaller in your eyes. No, course not. How are you, Luna? Harry asked. Very well. I was bitten by a garden gnome only moments ago. Luna holds up her finger, which is sheared in blood. Gnome saliva is enormously beneficial. Xenophilius Lovegood. We live just over the hill. Mr. Lovegood said. Nice to meet you, sir. Harry said. Mr. Lovegood suddenly leans close, whispering fiercely. I trust you know, Mr. Potter, that we at the Quibbler, unlike those toadies at the Daily Prophet, fully supported Dumbledore during his lifetime, and in his death support you just as fully. Come, Daddy. Caden and Harry don't want to talk to us right now. They're just too nice to say so, Luna said. Mr. Lovegood's eyes burn with righteousness, a triangular eye dangling from a chain across his neck. As Luna pulls him away, Harry glances once again across the garden. Harry bumps his elbow with Caden, gaining his twin's attention. He nods to the man sitting alone, and they start walking towards the man. Sir, may we sit down? Caden asked. Mr. Potters, by all means. In a nervous flutter, Mr. Doge pours Caden and Harry a goblet of champagne. I found what you wrote in the Daily Prophet very moving, sir. I take it you knew Professor Dumbledore well? Harry asked. I certainly knew him the longest, if you don't count his brother Aberforth, and somehow, people never do seem to count Aberforth. Mr. Doge said. I never even knew he had a brother, sir, Harry said, changing his words when Caden shakes his head. Yes, well, Dumbledore was always very private, even as a boy. Mr. Doge said. Sir, I was wondering if you'd had much contact with him before he died. Harry asked. The occasional owl, though it was strange. Mr. Doge said. Strange, sir? Harry questioned. It was the owls themselves. They often arrived in distress. It was clear they'd traveled great distances in some cases. Mr. Doge said. Could you tell us from where they'd come, sir? Harry asks while Caden takes a sip of his champagne. I'm afraid not. Albus' messages mostly referenced our days together as schoolboys. They were surprisingly intimate. When he did speak of his current activities, his words would turn elliptical. Still, I sensed he was under great stress. Why do you ask? Mr. Doge asked. Just curious. I was. Harry looks at Caden for confirmation and continues when the Hufflepuff nods. Close to Professor Dumbledore? Well, he treasured you, Mr. Potter. I can attest to that. I can also tell you that when a person passes, it's only natural to rue the things left unsaid, to regret the question never asked. I knew Albus nigh on 100 years, but in many ways he will always remain a riddle even to me. Mr. Doge said. Don't despair, Elphias. I'm told he's been thoroughly unriddled by Rita Skeeter. In 800 pages, no less. A woman said. Caden, Harry, and Mr. Doge turns, studying the profile of an ancient which sitting at an adjacent table, a glass of champagne cradled in the bony fingers of one hand. That woman is a vulture, Muriel, and you well know it. Mr. Doge said. Someone has to pick the bones to get at the truth. I read your obituary, Elphias. Lovely. But you did skate over some of the sticky patches in Dumbledore's life. Muriel said. I'm sorry you think so, Muriel. I assure you I was writing from the heart. Mr. Doge said. Yes, well, Rita Skeeter hasn't made that mistake, I'm sure. Word has it someone talked to her, someone who knew the Dumbledore family well. You and I both know who that is, Elphias. Muriel said. A monstrous betrayal. I can only conclude the rumors are true, and that she has become untethered. Mr. Doge said. Who are you talking about? Caden questioned. Well, I don't suppose it'll be a secret once the book comes out, Muriel said, relishing the moment. Bathilda Bagshot. Caden nodded slowly, but Harry didn't know who that was. Who? Harry questioned. Who? Bathilda Bagshot. My God, boy, she's only the most celebrated magical historian of the last century. Don't they read history of magic at Hogwarts anymore? Muriel said. Oh, right. Slipped my mind. Harry said. She knew the Dumbledores as well as anyone. She'd have letters, perhaps an interesting photograph or two. I'm sure Rita Skeeter would have thought it well worth a trip to Godric's Hollow to take a peek into that old bird's rattled cage. Muriel said. Godric's Hollow? Bathilda Bagshot lives in Godric's Hollow? Harry asked. 4 years now. That's where she first met Dumbledore. Muriel said. Excuse me? You don't mean to say Dumbledore lived there too? Harry asked. Of course. The family moved there after his father killed 3 muggles. It was quite the scandal, Muriel said, eyeing Harry. Honestly, my boy, are you sure you knew him at all? Harry sits, speechless, then his eye catches a shooting star, or what appears to be. As it plummets, it grows, gaining speed until it slices through the canopy, exploding in a burst of light. All goes silent as a silver lynx, graceful and gleaming, materializes amid the crowd. When it speaks, the Patronus has Kingsley's sonorous voice. The ministry has fallen. The Minister of Magic is dead. They are coming. The lynx vanishes, and a scream shreds the silence. Then there was chaos. Nice meeting you both, Mr. Potter. Mr. Doge extends his hand towards Harry before he disapparates. Seconds later, the Ancient which has done the same. Caden scans the scattering crowd and meets Victor's eyes, who nodded to Hermione. Caden nods back and makes his way towards Hermione, standing next to her as they call out for Ron. Suddenly, the canopy above turns to ribbons as Death Eaters descend into the crowd. Caden reaches out and grabs Harry's hand, clutching Ron's hand on the other. He watches Hermione close her eyes, and a great whooshing sound fills his ears. He takes one last look at Cedric and Victor as he is thrown up and back in a whirlwind, and all goes black. 63. A horn blares as a double-decker bus careens within inches of Caden, Harry, Ron, and Hermione as they stumble, the streets teeming with drunken pub crawlers. Where are we? Ron questioned, looking around. Shaftesbury Avenue. I used to come here to the theater with my mom and dad. Just popped into my head. I don't know why. Hermione answered, walking somewhere. They hurry on, glancing over their shoulders at the dark shapes that move within the crowd behind them. Strangers bumping by, faces passing in a paranoiac blur. A drunken man, a cackling woman with blood-red lipstick. This way. Hermione led them to an alleyway, taking refuge in the shadows. She instantly begins to rummage through her tiny beaded purse. We need to change. Ron and Harry look at each other's dress robes. From the purse, Hermione extracts 3 pairs of jeans, t-shirts, and a pair of light overcoats. How the ruddy, undetectable extension charm, Hermione said before Ron could finish his sentences. You're amazing, you are, Ron said, looking at Hermione with awe. Always the tone of surprise, Hermione said, and as she gives the bag a shake, there is loud echoing of heavy objects, as if something has fallen. That'll be the books, she said when they all look at her questioningly. The 4 slides into a booth in a cafe. Do you reckon everyone's all right at the wedding? Maybe we should. They were after both of you, mate. We just put everyone in danger going back, Ron said, cutting Harry's words off. Ron's right. Cappuccino, please, Hermione said to the gum-chewing waitress standing behind Caden and Harry. Ron, clueless when it comes to cappuccinos, nods to Hermione. What she said? Same, Harry said. I'll have a black coffee, please, Caden answered, leaning back against the booth. Wicked scar, the waitress said to Harry before leaving. So where do we go from here? The Leaky Cauldron? Ron asked. Too dangerous. If Voldemort has taken over the ministry, none of the old places are safe, Caden said, looking at the front door when it squeals and 2 workmen enter, glancing at them as they step to the counter. He keeps watch of them, looking at the small security mirror near the ceiling. My rucksack, with all my things. I left it back at the burrow. Harry cut himself short when Hermione shook her head. He eyes the beaded purse. You're joking. I've had the essentials packed for days, just in case, Hermione said, shrugging. By the way, these jeans? Not my favorite, but tight, Ron said. Hermione gives him a withering glance, almost flinching when Caden suddenly shouts down at them. The tile explodes on the wall where Ron's head had been only seconds before. A rope of green light singes Hermione's hair. Stupefy, Harry said, and the jet of red light hits the biggest Death Eater straight in the face and he crumples instantly. Expulsio, the Death Eater said, and the table behind Caden and Harry explodes and the spell ricochets, shattering the security mirror, sending shards raining everywhere, including one that laces Hermione's cheek, then striking the cappuccino machine, which sprays hot liquid all over the Death Eater. He bellows in pain, and Hermione and Ron hit him with twin stunning spells. As he spasms on the ground, Hermione adds another for good measure. Petri ficus totalis. He goes still. The waitress steps out of the back room, seeing the quartet, the wands, and her gum bubbles pops. Go, Cadence said, watching her leave without argument. He turns to Ron and Hermione. Lock the door, get the lights. Hermione nods and throws the bolt as Ron clicks the deluminator, pitching the cafe into shadow. Harry eyes the unconscious Death Eater. This one's name is Rowling. He was on the astronomy tower the night Snape killed Dumbledore. This is Dolohov. I recognize him from the wanted posters. Ron rolls him over with his foot. Dolohov's eyes shift in fear from Caden, Harry to Hermione, then back to Ron. So what do we do with you, huh? Kill us if it was turned round, wouldn't you? Ron said, face hard, noticing Hermione eyeing him uneasily. Suppose it's him that did Mad Eye. How would you feel then? Hermione looks at Dolohov. The moment hangs, and Harry was the one to break the silence. It's better we wipe their memories. We kill them, they'll know we were here. Harry said, you're the boss. Ron said, turning to Hermione. Hermione? Hermione turns, looking at him. Ron reaches out, wiping a trickle of blood from her cheek. You're the best with spells. Hermione was about to raise her wand, but Caden's hand stopped her. Caden points his wand at Dolohov. Obliviate, he said as there is a flash of light from his wand before it faded. A hand squeezed his arm, grateful. The four moves quickly, glancing about, paranoid. How is it they knew we were there? Harry asked. Maybe you both still have the trace on you. Hermione said. Can't be. The trace breaks at 17. It's wizarding law. Ron said. Hermione suddenly stops making Caden. Harry and Ron stop as well, looking back at her. What? Ron questioned, wondering why she had stopped walking. We didn't celebrate your birthday. Ginny and I, we prepared cakes. We were going to bring it out at the end of the wedding, Hermione said. Caden moves towards her and grips her shoulders, looking at her. Hermione, we appreciate the thought, honestly. But given that we were almost killed by a couple of Death Eaters a few minutes ago, Hermione nods. Right. Perspective. We've got to get off the streets, get someone safe. Ron said. I have an idea. Harry said. A door marked by the number 12. Harry taps his wand on the weathered surface and a series of metallic clicks are heard. The door swings open with a creak. The gas lamps spring to life, illuminating a narrow cobwebbed hallway. The quarter glances about, then Harry takes a step forward. Severus Snape? Mad Eye's voice is heard through the place. Mad Eye? Harry questioned, confused. Just then a great rush of cold air sweeps through the hallway, and the trio's tongues curl back in their mouths. Some things shift in the shadows at the end of the hall, rising from the carpet, tall, dust, colored and terrible-looking, then rushes towards them. It's Dumbledore, but a ghostly, worm-eaten Dumbledore. A corpse comes to life, with empty eye sockets and sunken face. It raises its wand and then explodes in a great cloud of dust, swirling like mist in the corridor, drifting back to the carpet. What was that about? Ron said, freaked. Mad Eye's doing, I'd guess. In case Snape decided to come snooping, Hermione said. Just then, a floorboard creaks and the four stiffen. Slowly, Hermione draws her wand, peering into the shadows. Hominum revelio. When nothing happens, she lowers her wand. It's a spell to reveal human presence, she said, extending her hand, watching the settling dust stream through her fingers. We're alone. 64. Harry. Harry. Hermione calls out through the place, glancing at Caden, who is still laying down on the couch, looking up at the head boy badge in his hands. She dashes up the stairs, seeing him, and exhales in relief. Ron. I found him. Caden sits up from the couch, placing the badge inside his pants pocket, and walks to where Hermione's voice came from. Good. Tell him from me he's a git. Ron shouts. Harry, you can't just disappear. We thought. Hermione stops as Harry hands her the letter. She feels Caden's body heat from behind her, reading the letter from behind her with her. It's from your mom. To Sirius. That Hilda Bagshot? Yeah, they knew her. She wrote a history of magic, you know? Harry said. Did she now? Hermione said with irony. I'm thinking maybe we should go talk to her. She still lives in Godric's Hollow. I'm thinking maybe she could help us, Harry said. Hermione looks up, regarding Harry closely. Harry, I can imagine why you'd want to go there, but I don't think Bathilda Bagshot is going to know where Voldemort hid his horcruxes. Harry starts to respond but frowns. Hermione reaches out, touching his face lightly. Hey, I think you three better come down here, Ron calls out. The three of them walk down the stairs to the first floor, joining Ron, who is peering out a curtain. In the courtyard outside, two dark figures stand near a tree. Another sits on a bench. The two clinging to the tree are Death Eaters for sure. Dunno about the bloke on the bench, Ron said, dropping the curtain. Can't see us, of course, but we'll have to be careful coming and going. Come on, there's something else you need to see, he said, leading them up the stairs and to a narrow doorway. Beyond is a cramped bedroom, walls covered with eerie scrawlings and symbols of dark magic. Lovely, Hermione said. Ron pulls the door shut. Affixed to the outside is a small sign, hand-lettered in a spidery crawl. Do not enter without the express permission of Regulus Arcturus Black. Regulus Arcturus Black? Hermione questioned, then gasped. Ron nods, extending his hand and taps the first letter of each name on the sign. R. A. B. Harry removed the note from the locket, reading what's on the note. To the Dark Lord. I know I will be dead long before you read this. I have stolen the real Horcrux and intend to destroy it. R.A.B. was Sirius' brother? Ron questioned, sitting round the kitchen table with sloppy stacks of old daily prophets surrounding them. Yes. Question is, did he actually destroy the real Horcrux? Hermione questioned. Harry nods, then spots a shadow trembling on the wall just outside the kitchen. He scrambles up and out of the room. Stop. I order you. Seconds later, Harry reappears, dragging Creature by one ear, who is mumbling foul oaths. Creature, Ron said. Been spying on us, have you? Harry asked. Creature has been watching. Creature always watches. Creature said. Maybe he knows. Caden said. Harry glances at him, realizing what he means, taking the locket and dangles it before Creature's massive eyes like a hypnotist. Creature watches it sway back and forth. Ever seen this before? Creature grumbles incoherently. Creature, we own this place. Sirius left it to us. Which means we own you too, Harry said. Creature grimaces mightily, then gives in. That was Master Regulus' locket. That's right. But there were two, weren't there? Caden asked, watching Creature's eyes widened in surprise. He nods again. Where's the other one? Creature doesn't know where the other locket is. Creature said. But was it here? Did you ever see it? Hermione asked. Creature spins, his face ugly and vicious. Filthy mudblood. The Death Eaters will soon be coming for you. Ron snatches Creature by the neck, shaking him. Blood traitor Weasley, Creature said, gargling the words. Ron, Ron, Hermione exclaimed. Reluctantly, Ron releases the elf. Answer her, Harry said. Yes, it was here, in this house. A most evil object. Creature said. How do you mean? Harry asked. Before he died, Master Regulus ordered Creature to destroy it. It was the last thing he asked of Creature, but no matter how Creature tried, he could not. Creature said. Where is it now? Did someone take it, Creature? Harry asked. Creature nods. He came in the night. He took many things, including the locket. Who is it? Caden asked. Mundungus. Mundungus Fletcher. Creature answered. The four glance at one another. Then Caden turns back to Creature, looking at him in the eye. Find him. With a crack, Creature vanishes before them. Ron fiddles with the radio, which whistles eerily as he attempts to find a signal. Harry lies on his side, studying the snitch in his palm, its wings flapping slowly. Caden is writing in his diary, placed on his lap. They have flesh memories, Hermione said, eyeing the snitch. Snitches. They're never touched by bare skin until the Seeker captures it. Even the wizard who fabricates it wears gloves. That way, if there's a dispute, the snitch can identify who first touched it. You mean, it remembers me? Harry asked. Hermione nods. When Scrimgeour first gave it to you, I thought it might open at your touch, that Dumbledore had hidden something in it. Harry ponders this, eyeing the wings flapping slowly, then a cracked sound echoes down the hall. Harry and Hermione race into the kitchen. Crazy shadows spill from a far door and pots crash. Suddenly, a tiny figure, wet and ragged, tumbles into view, bangs into the wall opposite, and scrambles up. As he starts back for the kitchen, he stops when he sees Harry, smiling. Harry Potter. So long it's been. Dobby was cut off by a hand reaching out, grabbing him by the neck and pulling him away. Creature, Dobby and Fletcher tumble from one side of the kitchen to the other. As they fly apart, Fletcher rolls to his feet, dripping wet, wand flashing. Expelliarmus. Fletcher's wand soars into the air, into Hermione's hand. As requested, Creature has returned with the thief Mundungus Fletcher. Creature said. Dobby has also returned with the thief Mundungus Fletcher. Dobby said, What are you playing at? Setting a pair of bleedin' ooze elves on me. Fletcher said. Dobby was only trying to help. Dobby saw Creature in Diagon Alley, which Dobby thought was curious. And then Dobby heard Creature mention Caden and Harry Potter's name, which Dobby thought was very curious. And then Dobby saw that Creature was talking to the thief Mundungus Fletcher, which Dobby thought was very, very, I'm no thief, you foul git. I'm a purveyor of rare and wondrous objects. Fletcher was cut off by Ron's voice. You're a thief, Dung. Everyone knows it. Everyone turns. Ron stands in the doorway, Caden missing from behind him. Harry asks Ron where Caden is with his face, and Ron nods to the room behind him. Dobby smiles. Master Weasley, so good to see you again. Ron nods, eyeing the bright red shoes on Dobby's feet. Wicked trainers. Listen, I panicked that night, all right? I never volunteered to die for you, mate. Can I help it if mad I fell off his broom? Stop lying, Hermione exclaimed, beginning to move towards Fletcher. Ron reaches out, taking her by the shoulders, eyeing Fletcher warningly. Piece of advice. Let's not rehash old times. Got it, mate? When you turn this place over, don't deny it. You found a locket, am I right? Harry asked. Why? Was it valuable? Fletcher asked. You've still got it, Hermione said. No. He's worried he should have got more money for it. Ron said. Wouldn't be difficult, would it? Bleedin' gave it away, didn't I? There I was, pitching me wares in Diagon Alley when some ministry hag comes up and asks to see my license. Says she's of a mind to lock me up and would have, too. She hadn't taken a fancy to that locket. Fletcher said. And who is this witch? Caden asked, leaning against the doorway. Well, she's right there, isn't she? Bleedin' bowin' all, Fletcher said, looking at Caden with silent fear as he points to a yellowed prophet on top of a nearby stack, where a squat woman with the face of a toad blinks from the front page. Dolores Umbridge. 65. An empty street corner. Then, Ron peers around a building. A few yards off, a witch named Mafalda Hopkirk approaches. Ron begins to walk, preceding her down the street, then kneels, fiddling with his shoelace. Zap. The witch stiffens and falls into the arms of Harry. Ron hurried back, takes her feet, and helps Harry hustle her into the storage area. They prop her up between two wizards, one tall, one short, both unconscious. Cedric is also here, the only awake one. Hermione is pouring Polyjuice potion into 4 cups. Right. So let's do it. Who gets who? Ron questioned, glancing at Caden and Cedric talking with each other. 1 second later, his eyes almost widened when Caden had to knock Cedric unconscious. Well, unless one of you fancies wearing a skirt, Hermione said, glancing at Caden knowingly but leans down and plucks a hair from the witch. Ron frowns as he surveys the 2 remaining wizards. Remember what we said? Keep your eyes down. Don't speak to anyone unless absolutely necessary. Act as normal as possible. Just do what you see everyone else doing. We do that, and with a bit of luck, we get ourselves inside. And then, Hermione trailed off. It gets really tricky, Caden said, placing an unconscious Cedric beside the witch. Correct, Hermione said as Harry and her look once more at the stunned trio before them. This is completely mental, Harry said. Completely, utterly, without question. Hermione agrees. The world's mental. Come on, drink up. We've got a horcrux to find, Ron said. The four, in their new identifies, emerge from the storage area. Ron, in the quiet of Reg Cattermole, takes out an ID card. In case you're interested, I'm Reg Cattermole, Magical Maintenance Department, Ron said. Mafalda Hopkirk, assistant in the improper use of magic office, Hermione said. Cedric Diggory, an Auror, Caden answered, fixing his coat and tie. And women flirt with me even though I am taken, he said, gaining a raised eyebrows from the trio. Harry pats his pockets. I'm nobody. You're somebody. Be careful, Hermione said. Just then, a skinny wizard strides by. Morning, Reg. Good luck today. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Ron said, glancing at the three and jerking his head towards the skinny wizard, and they follow. As the skinny wizard drops down the stairs into a public toilet, the four appear. What do you reckon he meant by good luck? Ron questioned. Caden, Harry, and Ron enter the gentleman's toilet while Hermione is at women's toilet. Glance around, then, seeing as everyone else is doing so, slip into cubicles. Caden enters a cubicle, hearing people flushing the toilet all around him. We flush ourselves in? He heard Ron ask Harry. Apparently so, Harry answered. That's bloody disgusting, Ron said, and Caden chuckles at that. Caden steps into the toilet fully, reaching up and pulls the chain and is instantly sucked down. Seconds later, he comes shooting out of a fireplace into the grand atrium of the Ministry of Magic. He sees Hermione and stands next to her, standing before a massive statue of black stone depicting a witch and wizard sitting upon hundreds of naked bodies twisted in pain. Harry joins them. Are those? Caden and Hermione nod in disgust, but Hermione was the one who answered Harry. Muggles. In their rightful place. Caden glances at the base of the statue, where the words magic is might are engraved. Just then, a balding wizard bumps into Harry. Move it, will you? Oh, Runcorn. Forgive me? The balding wizard hurries away, clearly frightened, as does another wizard, merely at the sight of Harry. You appear to be quite popular, Hermione said, glancing at Caden, who was looking at a blonde woman who was looking at him. Or rather, Cedric. Ron approaches, running a gauntlet of pitying looks from coworkers who echo the skinny wizard's good luck. I gotta tell you, I'm starting to freak out a bit. Just then, a gang of young, rough-looking wizards, led by their leader, enter the atrium, making a small group of captives. The ministry must be hiring young these days, Harry said. They're not ministry. They're snatchers. They hunt muggleborns and blood traders for a price. Ron answered. How long did you say this batch of Polyjuice potion would last, Hermione? Caden asked, turning his head away from the blonde woman, who seemed to be waiting for him. I didn't, Hermione said. Cattermole, a voice exclaimed, making the group jump except Caden. It's still raining in my office. 2 days now. Really? Have you tried an umbrella? Ron said. The man eyes Ron curiously, then leans forward menacingly. You do realize I'm on my way downstairs, don't you, Cattermole? Downstairs? Ron questioned. To interrogate your wife. If my wife's blood status were in doubt and the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement needed a job doing, I think I'd make it a priority. You've got 1 hour, the man said. Just then, the lift behind them clangs open. Hermione tugs Ron inside. The man turns and storms off just as the doors close on the blonde woman's face. Oh my God, what am I going to do? My wife's all alone downstairs, Ron said, making Caden arched an eyebrow at him with amusement. Ron, you don't have a wife, Harry said, calming his friend down. Oh, right, Ron said, remembering himself. Look, we'll go with you. Harry's words were cut off by Ron. No, that's mad. You three find Umbridge. I'll be fine. But how do I stop it raining? Ron questioned. Meteorologix recanto, Caden answered. Try finite incantatum. Of course, if something's gone wrong with an atmospheric charm, Hermione's words were cut off by the lift's voice. "This is you," she said to Ron. The lift opens, and Ron begins to back out. "Meteologinx recanto and finite incantum, okay? And if that doesn't work?"